For the young recruit standing stiffly at attention on the dusty parade grounds of Honshu, the world was defined by a single absolute truth. The Imperial Japanese Army was invincible because it possessed Yamato Damashii, the unique spiritual essence of the Japanese people. From the moment he donned his uniform, he was taught that war was not merely a contest of logistics or firepower, but a clash of spirits. His officers drilled into him the belief that while other nations fought for territory or political ideology, he fought for the emperor, a living god. This divine connection supposedly imbued the Japanese soldier with a moral superiority that no Western power could hope to match, creating a psychological armor that was as rigid as it was brittle. The indoctrination went far deeper than simple nationalism. It was a systematic deconstruction of the enemy's character before a single shot was fired. In the lecture halls of the military academies and the barracks of the infantry, the United States was painted not as a formidable industrial giant, but as a hollow shell of decadence. Japanese propaganda depicted Americans as heterogeneous mongrels, diluted by immigration and weakened by the selfish pursuits of individualism and capitalism. The narrative was seductive in its simplicity. How could a nation obsessed with jazz music, dance halls, and material comfort possibly endure the hardships of total war? To the Japanese command, the American soldier was a businessman in uniform, unwilling to die for a cause. This perception was reinforced by a deliberate misinterpretation of Western culture. The Japanese military code, the Senjinkan, demanded that a soldier choose death over the humiliation of capture, viewing surrender as the ultimate moral failure. Because Western armies operated under the Geneva Convention and viewed surrender as a valid military option when a situation was hopeless, the Japanese interpreted this pragmatism as inherent cowardice. They were told that Americans would throw down their arms at the first sign of adversity because they lacked the spirit of the attack. This cultural gap created a dangerous arrogance, convincing the average Japanese private that his enemy was psychologically fragile and would crumble under pressure. The training regimen of the Imperial Army was designed to prove this superiority through suffering. Recruits were subjected to brutal physical punishment, turning them into instruments of war who could march for days on a handful of rice. Officers frequently beat their subordinates to instill an iron discipline that transcended fear or pain. The logic was circular and reinforcing. Because the Japanese soldier endured such harsh treatment from his own superiors, he believed he was infinitely tougher than the soft American who slept in a bed and ate 3 full meals a day. The American reliance on supply lines and heavy equipment was viewed with disdain, interpreted as a crutch for men who were too weak to fight with their bare hands. History seemed to validate these dangerous assumptions. The Japanese psyche was still riding the high of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, where an Asian island nation had stunned a European great power. That victory was taught in schools not as a strategic win, but as a triumph of spirit over matter. Later, during the invasion of China, the ease with which the Japanese army swept through vast territories further cemented the idea that superior numbers and equipment meant nothing against the disciplined will of the emperor's soldiers. By the late 1930s, the veteran soldiers told the new conscripts that the Western powers were paper tigers, terrifying in appearance, but easily ignited and destroyed. The media landscape of Japan became an echo chamber for this rhetoric. Newspapers and radio broadcasts, strictly controlled by the state, featured caricatures of Americans as bumbling, effeminate, or overly dependent on machines. Cartoons showed Franklin D. Roosevelt and Churchill as demons to be slain, yet simultaneously depicted their soldiers as crying children. There was no room for nuance. The enemy had to be dehumanized and belittled to ensure that no Japanese soldier would hesitate to kill. The narrative stripped the American Marine of his humanity and his warrior status, reducing him to a mere obstacle to be swept aside by the divine wind of the empire. Specific tactical myths were also disseminated to the troops as factual intelligence. Soldiers were instructed that Americans were night blind and incapable of fighting in the dark, a fallacy that would lead to disastrous banzai charges later in the war. They were told that Westerners could not navigate the jungle, that the rain dissolved their morale, and that they required constant artillery support to advance even a few meters. These were not presented as rumors, but as military facts delivered by trusted commanders. Consequently, the Japanese soldier prepared for a war against an incompetent adversary, expecting short, decisive battles where his aggression would instantly shatter the enemy's resolve. As diplomatic tensions rose in 1941, the rhetoric shifted from general disdain to specific contempt for the American military capacity. The Japanese High Command calculated that while the United States possessed vast resources, its people lacked the stomach for a protracted, bloody conflict. They believed that a sharp, decisive blow would cause the American public to sue for peace rather than endure the sacrifice of war. This strategic miscalculation trickled down to the lowest ranks. The private in the infantry believed he was about to engage an enemy that was looking for the quickest way out of the fight, not one that was preparing to mobilize for total annihilation. By the time the fleets were moving into position, the psychological conditioning was complete. The Japanese soldier did not fear the American Marine. He pitied him. He viewed himself as a samurai of the modern age, heir to a warrior tradition that stretched back centuries, while his opponent was viewed as a hired gun lacking heritage or honor. This arrogance was not merely a morale booster. It was a blinder that obscured the reality of the sleeping giant across the Pacific. The conviction was absolute. The spiritual purity of Japan would inevitably triumph over the material gluttony of the West. Thus, when the war finally erupted, the Japanese army marched out with a fatal confidence. They were prepared to die, certainly, but they were wholly unprepared for an enemy that would fight back with equal ferocity. They carried with them the certainty that the Americans would run when the bayonets gleamed in the sunlight. They had been told the Americans were cowards, and they believed it with all their hearts, unaware that they were marching toward a collision with the United States Marine Corps, a force that would systematically dismantle every myth the empire had constructed. When the balloon finally went up in December 1941, the prophecies of the Japanese High Command appeared to materialize with terrifying precision. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a strategic masterstroke. To the Japanese soldier, it was divine confirmation. As news of the burning American battleships reached the troops stationed throughout the Pacific, the mood was electric. The sleeping giant had not risen in a terrible fury, as some had feared. Instead, it had been caught slumbering and crippled in a single morning. This initial success acted as a powerful accelerant to the soldiers' confidence, transforming their theoretical disdain for the West into a tangible, proven reality. The American Navy, the supposed guardian of the Pacific, had been humiliated, seemingly proving that material wealth could not protect a nation against the spirit of a dedicated warrior caste. Following the strike on Hawaii, the Imperial Japanese Army unleashed what became known as the Centrifugal Offensive, a blitzkrieg that swept across the Pacific with a speed that stunned the world. In every direction, the rising sun flag replaced the banners of colonial powers. Hong Kong fell in weeks. The Dutch East Indies crumbled shortly after. For the Japanese infantrymen, the speed of the advance was intoxicating. They were moving faster than their supply lines, often living off the land or captured stores, yet they encountered resistance that seemed to melt away before their bayonets. The seamless coordination between the Army, Navy, and Air Forces created an illusion of perfection, convincing the rank and file that their military machine was flawless and unstoppable. The campaign in Malaya served as a particularly potent boost to this ego. The British, long regarded as the preeminent colonial masters of Asia, were outmaneuvered by Japanese soldiers riding bicycles through impassable jungles. The fall of Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, was a psychological shockwave. When General Yamashita accepted the surrender of over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops, a force numerically superior to his own, it reinforced the racial and spiritual hierarchy the Japanese had been taught. If the British Empire could crumble so easily, surely the Americans, viewed as softer and less disciplined, would fare no better. The confirmation of American weakness came swiftly in the Philippines. While the defenders on the Bataan Peninsula fought tenaciously, they were plagued by a lack of supplies and air support. eventually leading to the largest capitulation in American military history. For the Japanese soldiers guarding the captives during the subsequent death march, the sight of thousands of starving, sick, and surrendering Americans was the ultimate validation of their training. They saw men who had chosen life as prisoners over death in battle, a choice that was culturally incomprehensible to the Japanese code of Bushido. In their eyes, these ragged columns of prisoners were not victims of poor logistics, but living proof of the moral bankruptcy of the United States. Even where the Americans managed to put up a fight, the outcome seemed inevitable. At Wake Island, a small garrison of Marines repelled the first Japanese landing attempt, sinking 2 destroyers. However, instead of sparking caution, this merely annoyed the Imperial Navy, which returned with overwhelming force to crush the defenders. To the average Japanese soldier, this was the natural order of things. Resistance was a temporary nuisance that would always be overcome by superior Japanese will. The captured Marines were paraded as trophies, further cementing the belief that no matter how hard the enemy fought, they would eventually break. Throughout early 1942, the Japanese Zero fighter ruled the skies, seemingly invincible against the sluggish American Wildcats and Buffaloes. Japanese pilots, veterans of the China War, danced circles around their inexperienced American counterparts. This aerial dominance meant that Japanese ground troops rarely had to look up in fear. The sky belonged to them. This air superiority protected the invasion fleets and allowed the Army to operate with impunity, fostering a sense of security that bordered on negligence. They began to believe that the American military was technologically inferior and incapable of producing a counterweapon that could challenge the agility of Japanese engineering. This string of unbroken victories gave rise to a dangerous psychological condition within the military hierarchy known as senchibayo, or victory disease. It was a collective arrogance that clouded judgment from the highest admirals in Tokyo down to the lowliest private in the jungle. They began to view the war as already won, believing that the United States was too demoralized to mount a counteroffensive. Planning became sloppy. Reconnaissance was neglected. Why bother with detailed intelligence when the enemy was destined to run? This overconfidence led to a fatal underestimation of the logistical challenges of expanding their perimeter so far from home. The empire had expanded to its limit, yet the ease of conquest tempted them to go further. Instead of consolidating their gains and fortifying their defense ring, the High Command decided to push into the Solomon Islands and towards Australia. They viewed these operations not as desperate struggles for survival, but as mopping up exercises against a defeated foe. The soldiers deployed to these remote outposts brought with them light rations and limited ammunition, expecting short, sharp engagements followed by another swift American retreat. They packed their dress uniforms for victory parades rather than extra quinine for the jungle malaria. By the summer of 1942, the Japanese military controlled a vast oceanic empire covering millions of square miles. They had achieved in 6 months what their war plans predicted would take years. The average soldier felt he was part of a divine destiny, marching under the protection of the gods. The embarrassing setbacks of the Battle of the Coral Sea and the catastrophic loss at Midway were largely concealed from the infantry. As far as the soldiers on the ground knew, the Imperial Navy was still the undisputed master of the Pacific, and the American fleet was at the bottom of the ocean. As the troop transports began to unload men and equipment onto a humid, obscured island called Guadalcanal in the southern Solomons, the mood was relaxed. They were building an airfield to cut off Australia, a construction project rather than a frontline fortification. The jungle was quiet, the sea was calm, and the Americans were nowhere to be seen. The Japanese soldiers pitched their tents and began their work, unaware that the tide had already turned. They were suffering from the advanced stages of victory disease, completely blind to the fact that the enemy they despised was about to land on their doorstep, bringing with them a new kind of war that would shatter their illusions forever. With the fires of Pearl Harbor fading into memory and the conquest of Southeast Asia complete, the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo turned its gaze toward the southern horizon. The initial war plans had been executed with such frightening efficiency that the Japanese perimeter now stretched far beyond what their logistics could comfortably sustain. However, a nagging problem remained: Australia. This massive continent to the south was the only remaining staging ground from which the Allies could mount a counteroffensive. While an outright invasion of Australia was deemed too costly in manpower, the Japanese strategists devised a more sinister alternative: isolation. By seizing a chain of islands in the South Pacific, they intended to sever the lifeline between the United States and Australia, effectively strangling the Allied war effort in the region before it could truly begin. The key to this strategy of strangulation lay in the Solomon Islands, a rugged double chain of volcanic peaks and fever-ridden jungles that sliced through the Coral Sea. Geographically, the Solomons were the perfect dagger pointed at the throat of the Allied shipping lanes. If the Japanese Navy could establish forward bases here, their long-range bombers could patrol the waters all the way to New Caledonia and Fiji. It was a bold extension of the defensive perimeter concept, transforming these remote tropical islands into an insurmountable barrier that would force American convoys to detour thousands of miles or risk destruction from the air. In May 1942, the Japanese made their first move by occupying the small island of Tulagi. It possessed a magnificent natural harbor, perfect for seaplanes and warships, but the island itself was essentially a steep ridge rising out of the sea, offering no flat land for a runway. While the seaplane base at Tulagi allowed for reconnaissance, it could not support the heavy Zero fighters and Betty bombers needed to dominate the airspace. The Japanese commanders looked across the skylight blue waters of Iron Bottom Sound to the larger, neighboring island of Guadalcanal. There, on the northern coast, they saw what Tulagi lacked: a vast, grassy plain known as Lunga Point, perfectly level and ripe for development. By June, as the decisive Battle of Midway was raging thousands of miles to the north, a different kind of fleet arrived at Guadalcanal. It did not bring combat divisions or tanks, but construction battalions and Korean laborers. Their mission was simple but critical: carve an airfield out of the coconut plantations and Kenai grass. The atmosphere was industrious rather than martial. The Japanese engineers surveyed the land with satisfaction, envisioning a bustling airbase that would serve as the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the South Pacific. They worked under the assumption of absolute secrecy, believing that this remote corner of the globe was too far from American bases to warrant immediate concern. The construction of the airfield at Lunga Point proceeded at a steady, methodical pace. Day by day, the dense vegetation was hacked away, and the coral soil was leveled to create a landing strip. To the Japanese garrison, this was merely another construction project in the expanding empire. They saw themselves as pioneers taming the wilderness, unaware that every tree they felled was being watched. High in the hills and hidden on neighboring islands, a network of brave Allied coast watchers, Australian expatriates, and loyal islanders were observing the activity through binoculars and radioing the intelligence back to Allied headquarters. When these reports reached Admiral Ernest King in Washington, the strategic picture shifted violently. King, a man known for his abrasive personality and aggressive intellect, immediately recognized the existential threat the airfield posed. If the Japanese were allowed to complete the runway and station land-based bombers there, the supply route to Australia would be severed. The Operation FS plan, the Japanese strategy to take Fiji and Samoa, would become a reality. King argued vehemently that the Allies could no longer remain on the defensive. The Japanese spearhead had to be blunted right there, at Guadalcanal. This realization catalyzed the first American offensive of the war. The timeline was dictated not by the readiness of the troops, but by the progress of the Japanese construction crews. Reconnaissance photos taken in July showed the scar on the Earth growing longer and more defined. Intelligence analysts estimated that the airfield would be operational by mid-August. This imposed a strict deadline on the U.S. Navy. They had to strike before the Japanese planes arrived. If Zeros were allowed to patrol the skies above the Solomons, any amphibious landing would be suicidal. Unaware of the panic they had induced in Washington, the Japanese on Guadalcanal continued their work in relative tranquility. The garrison was light, comprised mostly of construction units and a small naval guard force. They felt secure, protected by the distance and the perceived incompetence of the American military. The few rifles they had were stacked casually, and their defenses were oriented toward the sea merely as a formality. They prepared for the arrival of their own aircraft, not an enemy invasion fleet. The psychological dismissal of the American fighting spirit led them to believe that the U.S. Navy would never dare to venture this deep into Japanese-controlled waters. By the first week of August 1942, the runway was nearly finished. It was a masterpiece of manual labor, a flat, dusty strip that promised to extend the reach of the Emperor's power. The Japanese commander on the island sent a message to Rabaul declaring that the airfield was ready to receive its first wing of fighters. The mood was celebratory. They had accomplished their mission ahead of schedule. They looked forward to the sight of Japanese wings gleaming over the jungle, securing the southern flank of the empire once and for all. But the silence of the Solomon Sea was deceptive. Just over the horizon, hidden by bad weather and the curvature of the earth, a massive armada was steaming toward them. The strategic gamble of the Solomons had drawn the attention of the United States Marine Corps. The Japanese had built the trap, but they did not realize that they were the ones about to be ensnared. The stage was set for a collision between the Japanese expectation of a passive enemy and the reality of a desperate, aggressive American counterstrike. While the Japanese engineers on Guadalcanal were putting the finishing touches on their airfield, a whirlwind of activity began thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. and New Zealand. The decision to strike the Solomons was a strategic pivot that contradicted the agreed-upon Europe First policy. But Admiral Ernest King was adamant that the Japanese advance had to be checked immediately. The operation was officially codenamed Watchtower, a stoic title that implied vigilance and defense. However, among the planners and the officers who had to execute the impossible timeline, it quickly earned a far more accurate moniker, Operation Shoestring. The resources allocated were pitifully thin, ships were old, supplies were scarce, and the timeline was dictated not by readiness, but by the desperate need to beat the Japanese construction schedule. The tip of this hastily assembled spear was the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandergrift. Far from a polished war machine, the division was currently scattered across camps in New Zealand, expecting months of further training before seeing combat. Many of the men were raw recruits, teenagers who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor and had never fired a rifle in anger. When Vandergrift received his orders, he was incredulous. He was being told to launch a major amphibious assault on a hostile shore with less than 5 weeks to prepare. The division was understrength, under-equipped, and completely unaccustomed to jungle warfare, yet they were the only force available to stop the Japanese juggernaut. The scene at the docks in Wellington, New Zealand, was one of organized chaos. The Marines were forced to unload their cargo ships and then immediately reload them for combat, a process known as combat loading, where ammunition and fighting gear are placed on top for immediate access. In the cold winter rain of the southern hemisphere, the docks became a quagmire of sodden cardboard and cursing men. Because space on the transports was so limited, difficult choices had to be made. Essential heavy equipment, spare parts, and even long-term food rations were left behind on the pier. The Marines sailed for the equator carrying only the barest necessities, ammunition, rifles, and enough food for a few weeks, gambling everything on a quick victory. Compounding the logistical nightmare was an almost total blackout of intelligence. The United States military knew virtually nothing about Guadalcanal. There were no detailed topographic maps, no hydrographic charts of the depths, and no concrete data on the Japanese troop strength. Planners were forced to rely on colonial travel guides, fading photographs from missionaries who had lived there years ago, and vague memories of Australian plantation owners. The Marines were essentially sailing off the edge of the known world. They were invading a fortress they couldn't see, armed with maps that were often little more than hand-drawn sketches with large blank spaces labeled dense jungle. Despite these handicaps, the invasion fleet assembled in the Koro Sea near Fiji for a final rehearsal in late July. The practice landings were a disaster. Communications failed, landing craft broke down, and the timing of the waves was hopelessly off. General Vandegrift was despondent, fearing that Watchtower was destined to be a catastrophe. However, time had run out. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force that would protect the landings, delivered a sobering ultimatum. He would only keep his precious aircraft carriers in the area for 48 hours. After that, the Marines would be on their own, regardless of the situation on the ground. As the massive armada of 75 ships turned northwest toward the Solomons, a tense silence fell over the fleet. The men of the 1st Marine Division spent their time sharpening bayonets, cleaning cosmoline from their rifles, and writing letters home that they hoped wouldn't be their last. Unlike the Japanese soldiers, who were buoyed by myths of racial superiority, the Marines were driven by a grim, workmanlike resolve. They had heard the rumors of Japanese brutality, the rape of Nanking, the torture of prisoners, and they knew the enemy was formidable. They did not think of themselves as heroes yet. They were simply young men trying to mask their terror with bravado, sailing into the teeth of an empire that had never known defeat. Nature, it seemed, finally decided to favor the Americans. As the task force approached the Solomon Islands, a thick frontal system moved in, blanketing the sea in low clouds and heavy mist. This weather front acted as a providential cloak, shielding the fleet from Japanese search planes. For days, the Japanese base at Rabaul sent out patrols, but the ocean below remained a gray, impenetrable void. The armada slipped through the defensive perimeter undetected, a ghost fleet moving relentlessly toward its target. The element of surprise, which the Japanese had used so effectively at Pearl Harbor, was about to be turned against them. On the night of August 6th, the fleet entered the Slot, the narrow channel of water running down the center of the Solomon chain. The ships went to general quarters, the watertight doors were sealed, and the distinct smell of ozone and gun oil filled the passageways. Above decks, the Marines lined the rails, peering into the pitch-black darkness. To their left was Savo Island. Ahead lay the dark, looming mass of Guadalcanal. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hiss of bow waves cutting through the tropical water. It was almost inconceivable to the commanders that they had arrived without being attacked. Yet the Japanese shore remained dark and silent. In the final hours before dawn on August 7th, the soldiers of the rising sun were asleep in their tents, their rifles stacked, their officers resting comfortably. The coastal watchtowers saw nothing but the dark sea. They were secure in their arrogance, believing the Americans were paralyzed by fear and thousands of miles away. They had no idea that just offshore, the heavy guns of the USS Quincy and USS Vincennes were slowly rotating, dialing in the coordinates of their sleeping quarters. The alarm had not been raised. The trap remained unsprung. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern horizon, the sleeping giant took a deep breath. The landing craft were lowered into the water with quiet efficiency, circling like angry hornets. The waiting was over. The logistical nightmares, the lack of maps, and the fears of the unknown were pushed aside for the singular reality of the impending assault. At 6:13 a.m., the order was given to open fire. The silence of the Solomons was about to be shattered by the thunder of American retribution, marking the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire's expansion. The dawn of August 7th did not break gradually. It was detonated. At exactly 6:13 a.m., the stillness of Iron Bottom Sound was violently torn apart as the heavy cruiser USS Quincy fired the first salvo, followed instantly by the rest of the support fleet. For the Japanese on shore, the world dissolved into a terrifying cacophony of exploding shells and shattering timber. The bombardment was thunderous and relentless, churning the coastal palm groves into splintered matchsticks. The massive naval guns, which the Japanese believed were thousands of miles away protecting Hawaii, were now hammering their positions with point-blank fury. The psychological impact was immediate. The sense of invulnerability that had shielded the garrison for months evaporated in a cloud of cordite and dust. Simultaneously, the sky above the island filled with a roar of radial engines. Grumman Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers from the carriers Saratoga, Wasp, and Enterprise screamed down from the clouds, strafing the stunned defenders and bombing the airfield facilities. The surprise was absolute. Japanese officers, some still in their pajamas, scrambled from their tents to see the horizon filled with enemy warships. There was no time to man the coastal guns or organize a coherent defense. The meticulous air raid drills and the arrogance of the invincible Imperial forces were rendered useless by the sheer speed and violence of the American arrival. The only option for the stunned construction battalions was to run. Across the water on the smaller island of Tulagi, the fighting began almost immediately and with brutal intensity. Here, the Japanese garrison was composed of elite naval troops, not laborers, and they were dug into limestone caves. As the Marine raiders under Colonel Merritt Edson stormed the beaches of Tulagi, they were met with the ferocious resistance the planners had feared. It was a bloody, close-quarters brawl that previewed the savagery to come. However, on the main island of Guadalcanal, the situation was bizarrely different. The primary invasion force, the 1st Marine Division, motored toward Red Beach, bracing themselves for a slaughter that never materialized. The Marines in the landing craft gripped their M1 Garrons and Springfields, their knuckles white, waiting for the inevitable stutter of Japanese machine guns to cut through the hull. They had been told to expect a heavily fortified beachhead. Instead, as the ramps of the Higgins boats dropped into the surf, they were greeted by silence. There were no pillboxes, no barbed wire, and no enemy fire. The first wave of Marines stormed up the sandy slope and into the coconut groves, adrenaline pumping, only to find themselves alone. The bombardment had driven the Japanese deep into the jungle, leaving the landing zone completely undefended. For the young Americans, the anticlimax was disorienting. They established a perimeter and waited for a counterattack, but the only sound was the rustle of the wind in the palms and the distant boom of the naval guns engaging targets inland. It felt like a training exercise gone wrong. Emboldened, they began to push inland toward their primary objective, the unfinished airfield. The ease of the landing created a false sense of security among the men, a feeling that perhaps the Japanese were not the super soldiers the rumors claimed, or that the intelligence reports had vastly overestimated the enemy's strength. As the Marines advanced toward the Japanese encampments near the Lunga River, they stumbled upon a scene of panic flight. They found bowls of rice still warm on breakfast tables, uniforms hanging on lines, and construction tools dropped in mid-use. It was a ghost town. The Japanese had fled so precipitously that they left behind nearly all their supplies. Vast stockpiles of rice, soy sauce, and worst of all for them, their construction equipment. The Marines, hungry and tired, marveled at the bounty. They captured intact trucks, road rollers, and crucially, the nearly completed airfield itself, which they would soon christen Henderson Field. However, the chaos was not limited to the Japanese side. Back on Red Beach, the American logistics were unraveling. The plan had called for a disciplined unloading of supplies, but the lack of enemy resistance led to a rush of landing craft hitting the shore all at once. Boxes of ammunition, crates of rations, and drums of fuel piled up faster than the shore parties could move them. The beach became a congested junkyard of supplies, a bottleneck that would have been disastrous had the Japanese possessed any artillery to shell the landing zone. It was a mess, but it was a fortunate mess, born of an unopposed landing. High command in Tokyo was in a state of paralysis. The initial reports from Rabaul were confused and contradictory. Was this a raid? A major invasion? A diversion? The Japanese Navy, unable to comprehend that a full-scale American offensive was underway so deep in their territory, hesitated. They assumed the Americans had landed only a small reconnaissance force that could be easily swept aside. This underestimation bought the Marines critical hours to consolidate their hold on the airfield, digging foxholes and setting up machine gun nests in the very spots the Japanese had occupied just hours before. By late afternoon, the Marines had secured a defensible perimeter around the airfield. General Vandergrift came ashore, surveying the prize his men had taken without losing a single life on the main beach. The mood was one of cautious elation. They had achieved the impossible. They had walked right into the heart of the Japanese Empire and taken its newest airbase without a fight. The sun began to set over a scene of deceptive victory. The Marines cracked open captured Japanese sake and ate captured Japanese rice, joking about the easy war. But as the tropical night descended, a heaviness settled over the jungle. The ships offshore, nervous about Japanese submarines and air attacks, began to pull back. The Marines were now thousands of miles from home, standing on a hostile island, surrounded by a jungle they did not understand. The Japanese had run, yes, but they had not surrendered. Somewhere out in the black wall of trees, thousands of eyes were watching the American campfires. The easy day was over. The long, brutal night of Guadalcanal was just beginning. The Marines had kicked the hornet's nest, and the stinging was about to begin. As the Marines pushed away from the relative openness of the beachhead and stepped into the tree line, they entered a world that felt alien and actively hostile. The initial euphoria of the unopposed landing evaporated the moment the canopy closed over their heads. This was not the tropical paradise depicted in travel brochures. It was a claustrophobic nightmare of twisting vines, rotting vegetation, and towering hardwood trees that blocked out the sun. The air inside the jungle was stagnant and heavy, trapped like steam in a sauna. Within minutes, uniforms were soaked through with sweat that would not dry for months, and the sweet, sickly smell of decaying flora filled their lungs, a scent that would forever be associated with death. The terrain itself fought them with a ferocity that rivaled any human enemy. Moving even a few hundred yards required machetes and exhausting physical effort. The Marines encountered fields of kunai grass that grew taller than a man, its blades sharp enough to slice through skin and canvas alike. Underfoot, the ground was a treacherous slurry of mud and tangled roots that snagged boots and twisted ankles. The deeper they went, the more the island seemed to close in on them. Compasses became unreliable in the dense growth, and units frequently lost contact with one another, separated by only a few yards of green wall. The illusion of a cohesive military formation broke down into isolated squads struggling to maintain their bearings in a green maze. The silence of the jungle was a deception. It was a cacophony of biological noise, shrieking tropical birds, buzzing insects, and the rustle of unseen creatures that masked the approach of the enemy. To the raw, nerves-on-edge Marines, every snapping twig sounded like the bolt of an Arisaka rifle, and every shadow looked like a lurking sniper. Paranoia set in quickly. The men, who had been aggressive and confident on the ships, found themselves jumping at the sound of falling coconuts or the scuttle of land crabs. The jungle stripped away their depth perception and their confidence, forcing them to rely on primal instincts rather than their training manuals. This tension exploded into dangerous bouts of trigger happiness. As twilight approached on that first day, the nervousness of the green troops reached a fever pitch. A rustle in the bushes would prompt a Marine to fire, triggering a chain reaction where the entire line would unleash a torrent of lead into the empty jungle. Officers screamed for ceasefires, running up and down the lines to stop the waste of ammunition, but the fear was contagious. They were fighting phantoms. Reports filtered back to the command post of enemy attacks that turned out to be nothing more than wild pigs or the wind. The 1st Marine Division was learning the hard way that in the jungle, the imagination is a potent enemy. However, not all the shadows were empty. As the perimeter expanded toward the Matanacaw River, the first genuine contact with the Japanese occurred. These were not pitched battles, but fleeting, ghostly skirmishes. A patrol would take fire from a hidden position, dive for cover, and return fire, only to find the enemy gone when they advanced. The Japanese soldiers, stragglers from the construction battalions, and the naval guard, used the terrain to their advantage. They did not stand and fight. They harassed and vanished. This elusive style of warfare was frustrating and terrifying. It taught the Marines that there were no front lines here. The enemy could be anywhere, behind a tree, in the canopy, or even behind them. The physical toll of the environment began to mount immediately. The heat was oppressive, causing heat exhaustion and dehydration among men who were overburdened with gear. Canteens ran dry quickly, and the local water sources were often suspect. Mosquitoes, the true lords of Guadalcanal, descended in clouds, biting exposed skin and planting the seeds of malaria and dengue fever that would eventually incapacitate more men than Japanese bullets. The Marines began to realize that survival on Guadalcanal would require a war against the elements, as much as against the Imperial Army. As night fell on the first day ashore, the darkness brought a new level of terror. In the tropics, night does not fall gradually. It crashes down like a curtain. The jungle became an abyss of absolute blackness, where a man couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The Marines dug shallow foxholes, sitting back to back, straining their ears against the jungle noise. Every rustle was interpreted as an infiltrator creeping up with a knife. The Japanese, masters of night operations, played on this fear. They would fire a single shot, scream insults in broken English, or rattle equipment just to keep the Americans awake. Sleep was impossible. The psychological strain of the watch began to fray the nerves of even the toughest sergeants. It was during these initial probes that the Marines discovered the first evidence of the enemy's mindset. They found abandoned Japanese bivouacs that were neat and orderly, contrasting with the chaos of the American advance. They found diaries and letters that humanized the enemy, but also booby traps that demonstrated their ruthlessness. A discarded helmet might cover a grenade. A seemingly clear path might lead to a punji stick pit. The Marines learned quickly: touch nothing, trust nothing. The curiosity of the tourist was replaced by the caution of the survivor. By the second day, the objective of the airfield was fully secured, but the victory felt hollow in the oppressive humidity. The Marines had established a perimeter, a small bubble of American control in a vast, hostile wilderness. They were the invaders here, foreign bodies in an ecosystem that rejected them. The easy landing was a memory. The reality was the mud, the bugs, and the unseen eyes watching from the ridgelines. The officers tried to maintain discipline, ordering men to dig deeper and conserve water, sensing that the lack of major resistance was the calm before the storm. As the sun sank on August 8th, a deep unease settled over the command posts. The Marines were ashore, yes, but they were beginning to feel the isolation. The radio chatter from the fleet offshore was becoming urgent and worried. The men in the foxholes didn't know the strategic picture, but they could feel the shift in the air. They were thousands of miles from home, hugging the dirt of an island that wanted to kill them, waiting for an enemy they couldn't see. The jungle had swallowed them whole, and soon, the sea behind them would turn into a trap. While the Marines on shore were digging in for their second night, a vengeful storm was gathering to the northwest. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the commander of the newly formed Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul, was not a man to let an invasion go unanswered. Upon receiving news of the American landings, he immediately assembled a makeshift strike force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. His plan was simple but audacious: race down the slot under the cover of darkness, slip into the sound between Guadalcanal and Florida Island, destroy the Allied transports, and withdraw before the American aircraft carriers could strike at dawn. It was a classic Japanese tactic, a night attack relying on speed, surprise, and the lethal efficiency of their optical training and long lance torpedoes. The approach of Mikawa's fleet was a masterpiece of stealth and Allied negligence. As the Japanese ships cut through the calm waters of the Solomons on August 8th, they were spotted multiple times by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. However, a comedy of errors, misidentified ship types, and delayed communication reports led the Allied command to believe they were merely facing a seaplane tender escorting a minor reinforcement run. The alarm was never properly raised. Inside the Sound, the Allied fleet was tired. The crews of the cruisers USS Chicago, USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra had been at general quarters for 2 days straight. Exhausted and confident that the enemy was far away, the captains allowed their men to stand down, unaware that the executioner was already at the door. At 1 a.m. on August 9th, Mikawa's column glided silently past the picket destroyers, which failed to detect them in the gloom. The Japanese lookouts, possessing night vision that seemed almost supernatural, spotted the Allied silhouettes long before the Americans or Australians knew they were there. At 1:38 a.m., the silence was shattered not by gunfire, but by the eerie, hissing light of Japanese floatplane flares drifting down from the sky. The flares bathed the Allied ships in a stark, ghostly brilliance, illuminating them like actors on a stage. Before the Allied captains could even shout orders to the bridge, the Japanese opened fire. The southern group of the Allied patrol force, led by HMAS Canberra and USS Chicago, was obliterated in minutes. The Canberra was hit by 2 torpedoes and a deluge of shell fire before her guns could even be trained on a target. She listed heavily, a burning wreck drifting in the dark. The Chicago took a torpedo to the bow and lost contact with the formation. The speed of the violence was paralyzing. The Japanese ships, firing with practiced precision, tore through the southern defensive line without breaking stride, turning immediately north to engage the remaining American cruisers guarding the transport anchorage. The captains of the northern group, Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, were woken by the explosions to the south, but remained fatally confused. In the chaos, some commanders hesitated to fire, fearing they were witnessing a friendly fire incident between their own ships. This hesitation was their death warrant. Mikawa's searchlights snapped on, blinding the American bridge crews, and the Japanese gunners poured a withering crossfire into the U.S. ships at point-blank range. The Astoria was raked from bow to stern, her superstructure turning into an inferno. The Quincy charged the enemy line valiantly, but was caught in a crossfire that set her ablaze. She capsized and sank, taking hundreds of men with her. The Vincennes, the flagship of the northern group, suffered a particularly agonizing death. Illuminated by searchlights and pounded by 8-inch shells, she became a helpless target. Her steerage failed, her guns were silenced one by one, and she slowly rolled over into the black water. In less than 40 minutes, the Japanese Navy had handed the United States Navy the worst open sea defeat in its history. For heavy cruisers were sinking or burning, over 1,000 sailors were dead or dying in the oil-slicked water, and the defensive screen protecting the vulnerable transport ships had been wiped from existence. The body of water where they sank would earn a grim new name, Iron Bottom Sound. However, in the moment of total victory, Mikawa made a controversial decision. His charts showed he was behind schedule, and he feared that the American aircraft carriers were lurking nearby, ready to launch a dawn airstrike. Unaware that the U.S. carriers had actually withdrawn the previous evening to refuel, Mikawa chose to preserve his ships rather than press his advantage. He turned his fleet around and raced back up the slot, leaving the defenseless American transport ships, loaded with the Marines' food, ammunition, and heavy artillery, completely untouched. It was a tactical triumph, but a strategic blunder that would haunt the Japanese war effort. As the sun rose on August 9th, the scene in the Sound was apocalyptic. The water was covered with debris and survivors clinging to life rafts. But for the Marines on the beach, the true horror was just becoming apparent. Admiral Richmond K. Turner, commanding the amphibious force, looked at his shattered fleet and made a hard calculation. With no air cover and no cruiser protection, his transport ships were sitting ducks. He ordered the immediate withdrawal of all vessels. The unloading was halted instantly. Cranes stopped mid-swing, and landing craft turned back to the ships. General Vandergrift stood on the beach and watched in disbelief as the Navy pulled up its anchors. The transport ships, still carrying 75% of the division supplies, heavy artillery, coastal defense radars, and reserve ammunition, turned their sterns to the island and steamed away. The horizon, once filled with the comforting shapes of friendly steel, was suddenly empty. The 1st Marine Division had not just been landed, they had been marooned. They were 11,000 men stranded on a hostile island with only 4 days' worth of rations, limited ammunition, and no way home. The psychological impact of this abandonment was profound. The Marines realized they were truly alone, expendable pawns in a high-stakes naval game. The term Navy became a curse word in the foxholes of Guadalcanal. They looked at the thin supplies piled on the beach, their only lifeline against starvation, and then turned their gaze toward the jungle. The Japanese were still out there, gathering strength, and now the Americans had no ships to save them. The easy war had vanished in the smoke of Savo Island. Now it was a fight for survival against starvation, disease, and an enemy who knew they were trapped. Back in Rabaul, the headquarters of the 17th Army was buzzing with a dangerous mixture of confusion and contempt. The initial reports of the American landing had been processed through the filter of victory disease, resulting in a catastrophic underestimation of the enemy's strength. General Hyakutake and his staff estimated that perhaps 2,000 Americans had come ashore, a small, reckless raiding party that was likely already cowering in fear after the naval defeat at Savo Island. They did not realize they were facing a reinforced division of over 10,000 entrenched Marines. Viewing the recapture of Guadalcanal as a minor police action rather than a major campaign, they selected a unit that was available for immediate deployment, not for its size, but for its prestige. The 28th Infantry Regiment, commanded by the legendary Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki. Colonel Ichiki was a man who embodied the aggressive spirit of the Imperial Army. A veteran of the Manchurian campaigns, he had played a pivotal role in the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, the spark that ignited the war in China. To him, war was a test of will, and he held the firm conviction that the spiritual fortitude of the Japanese soldier was superior to any weapon the West could manufacture. When he received the order to retake the airfield, he was almost insulted by the assignment. He viewed the Americans as undisciplined amateurs, soft men who would flee at the first sight of a bayonet. He assured his superiors that he would not only recapture the airfield, but would likely do so in a single night. Driven by this supreme arrogance, Ichiki made a tactical decision that would seal the fate of his men. The transport ships available to him were too slow to carry his entire regiment of 2,000 men in one trip. Rather than wait to assemble his full force, he decided to take the first echelon, roughly 900 men, and attack immediately. He left behind his heavy artillery, his medical supplies, and most of his rations. In his mind, speed was the weapon. He believed that 900 battle-hardened Japanese soldiers were more than a match for any number of American conscripts. He boarded the destroyers with the swagger of a samurai going to execute a criminal, not a commander entering a modern combined arms battle. On the night of August 18th, the Japanese destroyers slid into the darkness off Taivu Point, about 22 miles east of the marine perimeter. The landing was unopposed and silent. Ichiki's men came ashore efficiently, their boots sinking into the black volcanic sand. They felt like ghosts, invisible and deadly. The jungle around them was quiet, and they took this lack of resistance as further proof of American incompetence. They organized quickly and began the long march west toward the airfield, moving along the coast. They did not move with the caution of a reconnaissance unit. They marched with the cadence of an execution squad, eager to deliver the emperor's justice. As they marched under the canopy of coconut palms, the heat and humidity began to sap their strength, but their morale remained dangerously high. The officers whispered to the men that the Americans were likely already demoralized, cut off from their navy, and starving. They were told that the enemy would probably surrender en masse once the firing started. Ichiki himself was so confident that he wrote in his diary about his plans for the occupation of the airfield, worrying more about how to feed the American prisoners than how to defeat them. He was marching into the teeth of a reinforced marine perimeter, yet he didn't even bother to send out adequate scouts to probe the defenses. However, the Marines were not the passive victims Ichiki imagined. General Vandergrift, aware that a counterattack was inevitable, had established a defensive line along the Illa River, misidentified on marine maps as the Tenaru River. The Marines had laid a single strand of barbed wire across the sandbar at the river's mouth and positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire. Crucially, on August 19th, a Marine patrol led by Captain Charles Brush stumbled upon Ichiki's advance guard. In a sharp, violent firefight, the Marines wiped out the Japanese patrol almost to the last man. When the Marines searched the bodies of the Japanese dead, they found something that chilled them: fresh uniforms, high-ranking insignia, and detailed maps marked with the location of the airfield. Intelligence officers quickly realized that this was not a straggling construction unit, but a fresh, elite combat force. The element of surprise, Ichiki's greatest weapon, had been lost. Van de Grift immediately reinforced the line at the river, moving the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, into position. They dug deeper foxholes, checked their 37mm anti-tank guns, and loaded them with canister shot, giant shotgun shells designed to shred infantry. Despite the loss of his advance guard, Colonel Ichiki remained undeterred. When he learned that his presence had been discovered, a more prudent commander might have paused, waited for the rest of his regiment, or attempted to flank the enemy through the jungle. Ichiki did none of these things. He viewed the skirmish as a minor annoyance. He reasoned that if the Americans knew he was coming, it only meant they would be more terrified when he arrived. He ordered his men to check their bayonets and prepare for a night assault. He would attack the enemy at their strongest point, right across the sandbar, relying on the shock action of the banzai charge to break the American line. The sun set on August 20th, casting long shadows over the sandspit at the mouth of the Illa River. On the west bank, hundreds of Marines sat in their foxholes, eyes straining against the gathering dark, fingers hovering over triggers. They could hear the distant sounds of movement in the coconut grove on the east bank, the clinking of canteens, the murmur of commands. They knew the enemy was there. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, the kind of silence that only exists in the vacuum before violence. Colonel Ichiki stood before his men in the darkness, the jungle breeze fluttering the ribbons on his chest. He did not offer them a strategy of maneuver. He offered them a path to glory. He told them that the enemy was weak, that their spirit was brittle, and that one determined charge would shatter the American defense. He gave the order to advance. As midnight approached, the 900 men of the Ichiki detachment began to move toward the river, stepping quietly onto the sandbar. They were walking directly into the sights of waiting heavy machine guns, blinded by a myth of invincibility that was about to be dismantled by the cold reality of American firepower. At 3:10 a.m. on August 21st, the oppressive silence of the Illa River was ripped apart by a scream that would haunt the nightmares of the Marines for years to come. A green flare hissed into the sky, casting a sickly, wavering light over the sandbar, and hundreds of Japanese voices rose in unison, shouting banzai. The sound was primal and terrifying, designed to freeze the blood of the enemy. Then, the dark mass of the Ichiki detachment surged forward. They did not use cover or tactics. They simply sprinted across the open sandspit, bayonets fixed, charging directly into the center of the Marine line. It was the physical manifestation of their spiritual superiority, a wave of human flesh hurling itself against a wall of American steel. But the Americans did not run. Instead, the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Al Pollock, opened the gates of hell. The darkness erupted with the muzzle flashes of heavy water-cooled machine guns and M1 rifles. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar that drowned out the war cries of the charging Japanese. The most devastating weapon in the Marine arsenal that night was the 37mm anti-tank gun, loaded with canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with steel balls. These guns fired point-blank into the mass of attacking infantry. The effect was gruesome and immediate. The first wave of Japanese soldiers simply evaporated, shredded by a storm of metal that tore through ranks of men with indifferent cruelty. Despite the carnage, the Japanese kept coming. Driven by an indoctrination that viewed retreat as worse than death, the survivors of the first volley climbed over the bodies of their fallen comrades to press the attack. The sandbar became a slaughterhouse. The smell of cordite mixed with the copper scent of blood and the sulfur of the river mud. In the chaos, a few Japanese soldiers managed to reach the Marine foxholes. The battle dissolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat, fought with bayonets, K-bar knives, and swinging rifle butts. But the Marine line, which Ichiki had dismissed as soft, proved to be an immovable object. The line bent, but it did not break. For hours, the assault continued in waves, each one weaker than the last. The Japanese mortar crews tried to suppress the American guns, but their fire was inaccurate and sporadic compared to the disciplined coordination of the Marines. By the time the first gray streaks of dawn touched the eastern sky, the momentum of the attack was spent. The sandbar was carpeted with the dead, a horrific testament to the failure of the banzai charge against entrenched automatic weapons. The surviving Japanese, realizing the airfield could not be taken by frontal assault, retreated into the coconut grove on the east bank of the river, digging into the sand and roots, trapped and wounded. As the sun rose, it illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The tide was washing against piles of uniformed bodies on the sandspit, bobbing in the surf. For the Marines, the daylight brought a shift in tactics. General Vandegrift did not intend to let the survivors escape to regroup. He ordered a counterattack to encircle the remaining Japanese forces. While one battalion held the river line, another battalion crossed upstream, moving through the jungle to flank the coconut grove from the rear. The trap was set. The hunters had become the hunted. To seal the fate of the Ichiki detachment, the Marines deployed their reserve of M3 Stuart light tanks. The tanks rumbled across the sandbar, their treads grinding over the debris of the night's battle. Entering the coconut grove, they fired canister shot into the treetops to kill snipers and rolled over the Japanese foxholes, crushing the shallow dugouts. For the trapped Japanese soldiers, the arrival of the tanks was a terrifying shock. These iron monsters were impervious to their rifles and bayonets. The grove became a cauldron of dust, smoke, and death as the perimeter was squeezed tighter and tighter. It was in this final phase that the Marines learned a grim lesson about their enemy. As they advanced past bodies that appeared dead, corpses would suddenly spring to life, clutching grenades or firing pistols at the Marines' backs. The wounded refused medical aid, choosing instead to try and kill one more American before they died. The concept of honorable surrender was non-existent to Ichiki's men. The Marines quickly adapted, adopting a grim policy of shooting anybody that looked suspicious. The battle transformed from a tactical engagement into a methodical extermination, fueled by a mixture of necessity and revulsion. Colonel Ichiki, the man who had marched his men to their deaths based on a fantasy of racial superiority, found himself hiding in the brush as his regiment was annihilated around him. The airfield he had promised to capture was visible just across the river, tantalizingly close but eternally out of reach. Realizing the magnitude of his failure and the disgrace he had brought upon his emperor, Ichiki performed the final act of the samurai code. He took his regimental colors, burned them to prevent their capture, and then committed ritual suicide, slicing his abdomen or shooting himself in the head. The reports vary, but the result was the same. The leader who believed spirit could conquer steel lay dead in the mud. By late afternoon, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the nearly 900 men in the Ichiki detachment, over 770 were dead. The Marines had lost fewer than 40 men. The disparity in casualties was staggering. Bulldozers were brought in to bury the Japanese dead in mass graves, as the tropical heat began to accelerate decomposition. The physical erasure of the unit was complete, but the psychological impact was even more profound. The myth of the invincible Japanese warrior had been shattered on the black sands of Guadalcanal. For the Americans, the victory was a revelation. They realized that the Japanese soldier was not a superman, but a fanatic who could be killed with superior firepower and discipline. For the Japanese high command, the news was a thunderclap. The cowardly Americans had not run. They had stood their ground and massacred an elite imperial unit. The Battle of the Tenaru marked the end of the Japanese Army's innocence. They were no longer fighting a colonial police action. They were locked in a death grip with a foe that possessed both the industrial might to arm themselves and the savage will to use it. The war had changed, and the true brutality of the Pacific Campaign had only just begun. With the smoke clearing from the slaughter at the Tenaru River, the eyes of every Marine on Guadalcanal turned skyward. For weeks, they had been battered by Japanese bombers operating with impunity from Rabaul, helpless to do anything but dive into foxholes and curse. But on the afternoon of August 20th, a sound unlike any they had heard before echoed off the jungle canopy. the throaty, distinct roar of American radial engines. The escort carrier USS Long Island had catapulted the first permanent residents of Henderson Field. 19 F-4F Wildcat fighters and 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. As the planes circled the field to land, grimy, bearded Marines leaped from their dugouts, throwing helmets in the air and cheering wildly. The arrival of Marine Fighter Squadron 223, VMF 223, meant that the Mud Marines were no longer alone. The Cactus Air Force, named after the Allied code word for the island, was open for business. However, the air base these pilots inherited was little more than a muddy scar in the wilderness. Henderson Field was a logistical nightmare. The runway was a strip of crushed coral and Marston matting that turned into a sticky quagmire when it rained and a blinding dust bowl when it was dry. There were no hangars, no radar stations, and no fuel trucks. The control tower was an abandoned Japanese pagoda-style structure that shook every time a bomb landed nearby. Mechanics worked in the open sun, plagued by snipers and malaria, patching bullet holes with duct tape and scavenged sheet metal. Fueling a plane meant hand-pumping aviation gas from 55-gallon drums, a back-breaking task that had to be done in the sweltering heat between air raids. The pilots themselves were a ragtag fraternity of Marines, Navy, and eventually Army Air Force flyers who operated in a state of perpetual exhaustion. They lived in tents that leaked, ate the same worm-ridden rice and spam as the infantry, and suffered from dysentery and fungal infections. They flew in shorts and t-shirts, often taking off while still shaking from the fever chills of malaria. Yet, this lack of polish belied a ferocious competence. Led by aces like Major John L. Smith and Captain Marion Carl, they developed a cavalier, aggressive culture. They knew they were outnumbered in flying inferior machines, but they also knew that they were the only shield preventing the Japanese Navy from pounding the island into dust. The aerial duels over Guadalcanal were defined by the technological disparity between the American F-4F Wildcat and the Japanese A-6M0. The Zero was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, fast, nimble, and possessing a climb rate that left the Wildcat gasping for altitude. In a turning dogfight, a Wildcat was a coffin. But the American plane was built like a tank, with armor plating protecting the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb punishment. The American pilots quickly learned that they could not outmaneuver the Japanese. They had to outthink them. They adopted the thatch weave, a tactic of mutual support, and used the Wildcat's superior diving speed to slash through Japanese formations, fire their heavy .50 caliber machine guns, and run before the Zeros could retaliate. The survival of the Cactus Air Force hinged on a secret weapon hidden hundreds of miles away in the jungles of the Upper Solomons, the Coast Watchers. Brave men like Martin Clemens and snowy-haired Australian Paul Mason lived behind enemy lines, observing the skies with binoculars. When the Japanese bomber formations lifted off from Rabaul, these watchers would tap out a warning on their bulky radios. 40 bombers headed yours. This warning gave the American pilots a crucial 40-minute head start, allowing them to scramble and agonizingly claw for altitude before the enemy arrived. Without this early warning system, the Wildcats would have been caught on the ground and destroyed in days. The rhythm of the air war became terrifyingly predictable. Around noon each day, a time the Marines sarcastically dubbed Tojo time, the black specks of Betty bombers would appear in the high blue sky, escorted by swarms of glittering Zeros. The air raid sirens, often just a metal triangle struck with a hammer or a breathless shout, would send the ground crews scattering. High above, the sky would streak with contrails as the Wildcats dove into the bomber formations. For the infantry watching below, it was a gladiatorial spectator sport. They cheered when a Japanese bomber trailed smoke and plummeted into the sea, and fell silent when a stubby-winged Wildcat spiraled down into the jungle. But the struggle was not limited to the air. The Japanese Navy, frustrated by their inability to knock out the airfield, began the Tokyo Express, running destroyers down the slot at night to shell the field. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force were denied sleep, crouching in foxholes as naval shells walked across the runway, shredding parked aircraft and igniting fuel dumps. Morning often revealed a boneyard of wrecked planes that had to be cannibalized for parts. A wing from a destroyed Wildcat would be bolted onto a survivor. An engine from a wreck would be hoisted into a fuselage with a bad piston. It was a war of attrition where the mechanics were as heroic as the pilots, performing miracles with wrench and wire to keep enough planes airworthy to meet the noon raid. Despite the daily losses, the Cactus Air Force began to bleed the Japanese air arm dry. The long flight from Rabaul, over 600 miles each way, pushed the Japanese pilots to their physical limits. If a Zero was damaged or ran out of fuel over Guadalcanal, the pilot was dead or stranded. If an American was shot down, he could parachute into the perimeter and be flying again the next day. This asymmetry began to whittle away the elite cadre of Japanese naval aviators. The veterans who had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor were slowly being killed off over the skies of the Solomons, replaced by greener, less skilled pilots who fell even easier prey to the hardening American aces. The tactical impact of the Cactus Air Force was profound. Because the Americans controlled the daylight skies, the Japanese could not bring in slow, heavy transport ships to land heavy artillery or tanks. They were forced to rely on fast destroyers making night runs, dropping off soldiers with only light weapons and limited rations. The airfield acted as a cork in the bottle of Japanese logistics. It turned Guadalcanal into a sinkhole for the Imperial Army, forcing them to feed men into a grinder where they could not be adequately supplied or supported. By late September, the pilots of the Cactus Air Force were gaunt, hollow-eyed ghosts, pushed beyond the breaking point of human endurance. Yet, they held the line. They had turned the airspace above the Solomons into a kill zone that the Japanese could not dominate. As fresh squadrons eventually arrived to rotate them out, they left behind a legacy of defiance. They had proved that the Japanese Zero was not invincible and that the sky, like the jungle below, could be retaken. But the Japanese were not done. Realizing that the airfield was the center of gravity for the entire campaign, the Imperial Army began massing its forces for a grand offensive designed to overrun the runway once and for all. Following the disaster at the Tenaru, the Japanese High Command realized that a single regiment was insufficient to dislodge the Americans. They escalated their commitment, dispatching Major General Kyosuke Kawaguchi and his brigade to Guadalcanal. Kawaguchi, a thoughtful and tactical officer, rejected the mindless frontal assaults that had doomed Colonel Ichiki. Instead, he devised a plan to strike at the soft underbelly of the American perimeter. He correctly deduced that the Marines were heavily fortified along the coast, facing the sea, but their rear guard facing the deep jungle was thin. Kawaguchi marched his 3,000 men on a grueling, circuitous trek through the chaotic interior of the island, moving like a giant centipede through the stifling rainforest, aiming to emerge from the jungle directly south of Henderson Field. The key to the southern defense was a grassy, coral spine that rose out of the jungle canopy like the back of a sleeping dinosaur. The Marines called it Lunga Ridge, but history would remember it by a darker name. It offered a direct corridor to the airfield. Whoever held the ridge controlled the fate of the island. Understanding its strategic value, General Vandegrift ordered Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson to occupy the position. Edson's force, a composite group of elite Marine raiders and paratroopers, was battle-hardened but physically shattered. They had been sent to the ridge for a rest, hoping to recover from dysentery and the lingering exhaustion of the Tulagi invasion. Instead, they were walking into the crosshairs of the entire Japanese offensive. On the night of September 12th, the jungle silence south of the ridge began to fragment. Kawaguchi's probing attacks tested the raider lines, cutting telephone wires and shouting insults from the darkness to sow confusion. It was a disjointed, terrifying night of skirmishes that confirmed Edson's worst fears. The main Japanese force was not attacking the beach, but was massing right in front of him. The next morning, Edson addressed his troops. He was a man of few words, known for his icy blue eyes and disregard for his own safety. He told his exhausted, sickness-ridden men, "You men have done enough, and I have no right to ask more of you. But there is just us between the airfield and the Japs. If we don't hold, we lose Guadalcanal." As the sun set on September 13th, the atmosphere on the ridge was electric with dread. The Marines, dug into shallow foxholes along the grassy slopes, watched the tree line fade into blackness. At 9 p.m., the attack began not with a scream, but with a bombardment. Japanese cruisers offshore and artillery in the jungle pummeled the ridge, shaking the coral bedrock. Then, red flares popped overhead, the signal for the assault. From the dark treeline, thousands of Japanese soldiers surged up the slopes. Unlike the Tenaru, this was not a chaotic mob. It was a coordinated, relentless wave of infantry determined to overrun the American positions through sheer weight of numbers. The forward Marine platoons were hit with a sledgehammer blow. In the swirling darkness, the fighting disintegrated into a series of desperate, isolated brawls. Japanese soldiers broke through the lines, engaging the raiders with bayonets and swords. The Marine right flank began to crumble under the pressure, forcing Edson to pull his men back to the final knoll, Hill 123. It was a fighting withdrawal, executed in the pitch black, with men dragging their wounded comrades while firing blindly into the screaming mass of enemy soldiers pursuing them. The situation was critical. If Hill 123 fell, the path to the airfield and the division command post would be wide open. At the center of the storm stood Colonel Edson. He seemed everywhere at once, walking upright through the machine gun fire, grabbing frightened Marines by the shoulder and positioning them into new firing lines. His presence was the glue that held the shattering battalion together. When ammunition ran low, the raiders fought with pistols and knives. The Japanese reached the crest of the hill, and for a few terrifying moments, the battle hung in the balance. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and burning cordite, the screams of the dying drowning out the orders of the officers. The savior of the ridge, however, came from the rear. The 11th Marines, the artillery regiment, began to drop a curtain of steel around Edson's position. Calls for fire support came in danger close, meaning the shells were landing just yards in front of the Marine foxholes. The 105 mm howitzers fired ceaselessly, their barrels glowing red-hot in the night. This wall of shrapnel chewed up the Japanese reserves as they tried to climb the slope. Kawaguchi's men were caught in a meat grinder, unable to advance through the artillery barrage and unable to stay on the exposed grassy slopes without being cut down by raider machine guns. The climax of the battle raged until the early hours of the morning. The Japanese launched wave after wave, driven by desperation, but the thin line of raiders, bolstered by the terrifying accuracy of the artillery, refused to break. At one point, Japanese officers managed to infiltrate the perimeter, shouting "Banzai," only to be cut down by the personal weapons of the Marine headquarters staff. It was a contest of endurance. The Japanese had the numbers, but they had exhausted themselves hacking through the jungle to get there, while the Marines were fighting with the desperate fury of men who knew there was nowhere left to retreat. As dawn broke on September 14th, the firing slowly sputtered out. The rising sun revealed the magnitude of the slaughter. The grassy slopes of the ridge were carpeted with the bodies of Japanese soldiers, twisted in the unnatural poses of violent death. Over 600 of Kawaguchi's best troops lay dead on the hill. Hundreds more would die of their wounds in the jungle retreat. The raiders had suffered heavily as well, losing 40 dead and over 100 wounded, a staggering cost for a unit already depleted. But looking back over their shoulders, they saw the pagoda of the airfield control tower still standing, safe and untouched. General Kawaguchi, watching his shattered brigade limp back into the jungle, was forced to accept a bitter truth. The Americans were not cowards. They had stood toe-to-toe with the Imperial Army in a night fight, the supposed specialty of the Japanese, and had beaten them. The ridge was renamed Bloody Ridge by the men who survived it. The victory secured the airfield for another month, but more importantly, it solidified the legend of the Marines on Guadalcanal. They had stared into the abyss of defeat on that coral spine, and, through grit and artillery, had pushed the enemy back into the dark. As the dust settled on Bloody Ridge, the strategic stalemate of Guadalcanal calcified into a deadly rhythm defined by the clock. The Americans owned the day, their planes patrolling the blue skies and punishing any Japanese ship foolish enough to venture near. But the night belonged to the Imperial Navy. Realizing that slow transport ships were easy prey for the Cactus Air Force, the Japanese High Command improvised a desperate logistical solution known as rat transportation, or as the Marines bitterly called it, the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers, stripped of heavy equipment to maximize speed, would race down the slot, the long channel of water running through the Solomons, under the cover of darkness. They would arrive off Guadalcanal around midnight, dump drums of rice and hundreds of soldiers into the surf, and sprint back to the safety of Rabaul before the sun and the American dive bombers rose. For the Japanese soldiers crammed onto the decks of these destroyers, the journey was a terrifying ordeal. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, exposed to the elements and the constant fear of American submarines. When the destroyers reached the drop-off points at Tassafaronga or Cape Esperance, the chaos was absolute. The ships would not stop. They would merely slow down, shoving the floating drums of supplies overboard and ordering the troops to jump into the black water. Often, the currents were too strong, or the barges failed to arrive. Crucial supplies drifted out to sea or sank, leaving the reinforcements to wash ashore wet, weaponless, and already hungry. The Express was a marvel of naval discipline, but a disaster of logistics. For every ton of supplies sent, only a fraction reached the starving stomachs of the Army. For the Marines on shore, the sound of the Tokyo Express became the soundtrack of their insomnia. Every night, the distinct, high-pitched whine of Japanese destroyer turbines would drift across the water, followed by the crack of 5-inch guns. These nuisance shellings were designed to keep the Americans awake, shredding their nerves rather than their fortifications. The Marines learned to differentiate between the annoying drone of Washing Machine Charlie, a lone Japanese plane that dropped flares and light bombs, and the sharp, flat trajectory of naval gunfire. Sleep became a luxury. The men in the foxholes lay with their eyes open, staring at the canvas of their tents, waiting for the whistle of incoming steel. However, in early October, the tenor of the campaign changed. The Japanese decided that the rat transportation was insufficient to prepare for their next massive offensive. They needed to land heavy artillery, tanks, and thousands of tons of ammunition, which required slow, vulnerable cargo ships. To make this possible, they had to neutralize Henderson Field completely. The nightly destroyer runs intensified, but they were merely the prelude. On the night of October 11th, a confusing naval skirmish at Cape Esperance resulted in an American tactical victory, but it failed to stop the flow of Japanese reinforcements. The Japanese Navy, stung but undeterred, decided to escalate the violence to a level the Americans had not yet imagined. The night of October 13th began with a deceptive calm. The Marines were accustomed to the nightly harassment, but the sound that rolled across Iron Bottom Sound that evening was deeper and more ominous than the usual destroyer engines. Two giants of the Imperial fleet, the battleships Congo and Haruna, had slipped down the slot undetected. Escorted by a light cruiser and 9 destroyers, these floating fortresses maneuvered into position just off Lunga Point. They were not carrying standard armor-piercing rounds. Their magazines were loaded with Type 3 Sanshiki shells, specialized incendiary anti-aircraft munitions designed to rain fire and shrapnel over a wide area. At 1:33 a.m., the world ended for the men at Henderson Field. The battleships opened fire with their massive 14-inch guns. To the Marines huddled in their dugouts, the sound was not like a cannon shot. It was like the collision of planets. The shells, weighing nearly 1,500 pounds each, roared through the air with a noise the men described as flying boxcars. When they impacted, the earth didn't just explode, it liquefied. The concussions were so powerful they knocked men unconscious in their foxholes and caused noses and ears to bleed from the overpressure. The jungle floor heaved and rolled like a ship at sea, terrorizing veterans who had thought themselves immune to fear. The bombardment lasted for nearly 90 minutes, an eternity of helpless terror. The Japanese gunners walked their fire back and forth across the airfield with mathematical precision. The Type 3 shells exploded overhead, showering the area with steel rain and incendiary tubes that set everything ablaze. The fuel dump was hit, sending a pillar of fire thousands of feet into the night sky, turning the darkness into a hellish noon. Parked aircraft were tossed into the air like toys, their aluminum skins melting in the inferno. The aviation gasoline drums, the precious lifeblood of the Cactus Air Force, exploded in chain reactions that shook the entire island. When the Congo and Haruna finally ceased fire and turned north, they left behind a landscape of utter ruin. Henderson Field looked like the surface of the moon. Of the 90 aircraft stationed there, more than half were completely destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The runway was cratered and littered with shrapnel. The field hospital had been hit, adding to the screaming chaos. The psychological blow was devastating. The Marines felt a profound sense of abandonment. Their own Navy seemed powerless to stop these monsters from parking offshore and leisurely destroying them. The invincible shield of the U.S. Navy felt very far away that night. The following morning, the sun rose over a scene of desolation. Marines wandered through the smoke, stunned and deafened, looking at the twisted wreckage of their defenses. But the true horror was visible out at sea. Because the airfield had been neutralized, a Japanese convoy of 6 heavy transport ships was boldly approaching the island in broad daylight. There were no wildcats to strafe them, no dauntless bombers to sink them. The Japanese anchored leisurely at Tassafaronga, just miles down the coast, and began unloading 4,500 troops of the 2nd Division, along with the heavy 150mm howitzers that the destroyers could never carry. The nightmares from the sea had done their job. The Japanese had successfully suppressed the American air power and delivered the hammer they intended to use to crush the Marine perimeter. The Marines watched helplessly through their binoculars as the enemy unloaded tanks and crates of ammunition, knowing that every piece of equipment landing on that beach would soon be thrown at them. The bombardment of October 13th had leveled the playing field, and as the fresh Japanese troops marched into the jungle, the stage was set for the largest and most desperate land battle of the campaign. The question was no longer whether the Marines could hold the airfield, but whether they would survive the week. To the west of the Marine perimeter lay the Matanacaw River, a dark, sluggish ribbon of water that snaked down from the jagged interior mountains to the sea. Unlike the Tenaru, which had been a site of defensive slaughter, the Matanacaw became a treacherous offensive battleground. General Vandegrift realized that allowing the Japanese to congregate undisturbed on the west bank was suicidal. It gave them free rein to position the heavy artillery that was slowly chipping away at Henderson Field. To protect the airbase, the Marines had to push their lines outward, crossing this natural moat and entering a terrain that was even more inhospitable than the coconut groves of the coast. The region was a chaotic jumble of steep coral ridges, deep ravines filled with rotting vegetation, and blind corners where death waited in the shadows. The initial attempts to cross the river in late September were disasters that bordered on catastrophe. The Marines, still learning the bloody calculus of jungle warfare, attempted a complex 3-pronged attack that relied on precise timing, a near impossibility in the communication-dead zones of the rainforest. One battalion, led by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, found themselves trapped in a narrow ravine, pinned down by unseen Japanese machine gunners dug into the cliffs above. The geography turned against them. The ridges blocked their radio signals, and the heavy canopy swallowed the smoke of their signal grenades. It took a desperate evacuation by landing craft, manned by a signals petty officer named Douglas Monroe, who would die providing covering fire, to save the Marines from annihilation. The green hell of the Matanacaw had drawn first blood, proving that aggression without intelligence was a death sentence. Stung by this failure, the Marines regrouped and adapted. They realized that the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment, which held the river, was using the terrain to mask their numbers. The Japanese had turned the root systems of giant banyan trees into hardened bunkers and hollowed out caves in the limestone ridges. Fighting here was not about sweeping maneuvers. It was a game of inches. A squad would advance until it drew fire, pinpoint the enemy muzzle flash, and then ruthlessly eliminate the position with grenades and mortars. The war along the river devolved into a series of intimate, vicious duels where the enemy was often smelled before he was seen. By early October, The pressure to clear the Matanacaw grew intense. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were landing heavy reinforcements, the vanguard of the 2nd Division, on the beaches further west. Van de Grift ordered a second, larger offensive to push the Japanese artillery out of range of the airfield. This time, the operation was methodical. The Marines used their own artillery to scour the ridgelines before advancing, turning the lush jungle into a splintered wasteland of cratered mud. They moved slowly, checking every tree and every shadow, having learned the hard lesson that speed in the jungle led only to an ambush. The fighting for the river mouth was particularly savage. The Japanese had established interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar, recreating the deadly geometry of the Tenaru, but in reverse. Marine snipers engaged in day-long waiting games with their Japanese counterparts, lying motionless for hours in the stifling heat, waiting for a helmet to break the silhouette of the foliage. The river itself ran red with blood and silt, bodies drifting downstream to be fed upon by the crocodiles that infested the estuary. It was a place where the veneer of civilization wore thin, and men fought with a primal desperation to secure a few yards of muddy bank. Despite the ferocity of the Japanese defense, the weight of American firepower began to tell. In the Second Battle of the Matanacaw, the Marines managed to flank the Japanese positions, trapping a battalion of the Japanese 4th Regiment in a wooded ravine. The result was a methodical destruction of the enemy force. American mortars rained down into the gorge, while machine guns cut off any escape. When the guns finally fell silent, the ravine was filled with the bodies of over 600 Japanese soldiers. It was the first time the Marines had successfully executed a large-scale offensive operation on the island, proving they could root the enemy out of their prepared defenses. However, the victory at the Matanacaw revealed a disturbing truth. On the bodies of the Japanese officers, intelligence sections found maps and orders detailing the size of the force gathering against them. The prisoners they captured were not the ragged, starving survivors of the early campaign. They were fresh, well-fed troops from the 2nd Division, soldiers who had conquered the Dutch East Indies. The documents confirmed that the Japanese were not just holding the line. They were amassing a force of over 20,000 men for a decisive blow. The fighting at the river had been a spoiling attack, a jab to keep the enemy off balance, but the haymaker was still coming. As the Marines consolidated their new positions west of the river, they could hear the sounds of heavy industry in the deep jungle. The Japanese engineers were cutting a trail, the Maruyama Road, through the impossibly dense interior, dragging artillery pieces and supplies by hand over precipitous ridges. The 17th Army was moving like a slow, crushing landslide toward the southern perimeter of Henderson Field. The Matanacaw had been secured, but it was merely the western flank. The real threat was moving to the south, into the trackless wilderness, where no defensive lines existed. The psychological toll of the Matanacaw campaign lingered with the men. They had seen the enemy's willingness to die rather than surrender, and they had experienced the terror of being cut off in the jungle. The green hell had stripped away their innocence. They looked at the wall of trees not as scenery, but as a living entity that concealed a relentless predator. The river crossing had bought the airfield a little more breathing room, and it had disrupted the Japanese timetable, but it had not stopped the inevitable. By mid-October, the perimeter quieted down, but it was a heavy, ominous silence. The Marines pulled back to their main lines, leaving listening posts in the jungle. They cleaned their weapons, sharpened their bayonets, and waited. The battles at the Matanacaw had been brutal skirmishes, but the coming storm, the Japanese grand offensive, promised to be the cataclysm that would decide the fate of Guadalcanal. The jungle had tested them, but now the entire might of the Imperial Army was about to fall upon them. The Japanese plan to retake Guadalcanal was grand in scale, but rooted in a fatal ignorance of the terrain. Lieutenant General Masao Murayama, commanding the elite 2nd Sendai Division, was ordered to lead 20,000 men on a surprise march through the untamed interior to strike the airfield from the south, the same direction from which Edson had been attacked, but with a much larger force. What appeared as a simple arrow on a map in the headquarters turned into a death march in reality. The Maruyama Road was a fiction. There was no road, only a dense, vertical tangle of rainforest that had to be hacked through yard by yard. As the soldiers dragged their heavy artillery pieces and ammunition crates through the mud, the jungle began to disintegrate the army before it even reached the battlefield. Exhaustion and hunger set in rapidly, forcing the abandonment of most of the heavy guns that were essential for the attack's success. The entire offensive relied on a delicate synchronization that the jungle made impossible to maintain. The plan called for a two-pronged assault, a diversionary attack along the coast by Major General Sumiyoshi to draw the Marines' attention, followed immediately by Maruyama's massive hammer blow from the south. However, Maruyama's column was hopelessly delayed, bogged down in ravines and river crossings that didn't appear on their maps. Unaware of the delay due to poor radio communications, Sumiyoshi launched his attack on October 23rd alone. His tanks clattered out of the coconut groves at the Matanakar River, straight into the sights of waiting Marine 37mm anti-tank guns. The attack was a massacre. The tanks were turned into burning coffins, and the diversion failed to draw Marine reserves away from the southern perimeter. It only served to alert General Vandegrift that the major blow was imminent. Meanwhile, to the south of Henderson Field, the situation was tense. The sector facing the deep jungle was held by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by the pugnacious Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller. His men were stretched thin, covering a front of 2,500 yards, far too wide for a single battalion. They had cleared fields of fire and strung barbed wire, but they were exhausted and suffering from the same tropical diseases as the enemy. As the sun set on October 24th, a heavy tropical downpour began, turning the foxholes into mud baths and obscuring the moon. Under this cloak of chaotic weather, the first elements of Maruyama's Sendai Division finally emerged from the tree line, late, starving, but desperate to fight. The attack began not with a bombardment, but with the sudden, terrifying cutting of the perimeter wire. The Japanese infantry, screaming their loyalty to the emperor, surged out of the rain in human waves. They threw themselves against Puller's lines, tossing grenades and firing from the hip. The darkness was illuminated by the strobing flashes of machine gun fire and the explosions of mortar shells. The Marines, outnumbered and fighting in near total blindness, held their ground with a savage determination. The heavy water-cooled Browning machine guns became the anchors of the defense, their barrels glowing red-hot as gunners poured thousands of rounds into the charging masses. It was a brawl at point-blank range, where the distinction between officer and private dissolved in the desperate need to keep the guns firing. In the heat of the battle, a critical evolution in the campaign occurred. Realizing that Puller's Marines were on the verge of being overrun by the sheer weight of the Japanese numbers, General Vandegrift made a fateful decision. He ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 164th Infantry Regiment, U.S. Army National Guard troops who had recently arrived on the island, to reinforce the line. This was a gamble. These were weekend warriors from North Dakota who had never seen combat. But as they ran through the rain and jumped into the muddy foxholes alongside the ragged Marines, they fought with the poise of veterans. The integration was seamless. Marines fed ammunition belts to Army gunners, and Army riflemen protected the flanks of Marine positions. The inter-service rivalry vanished, replaced by a brotherhood of survival. The heroism of that night was personified by Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone. Commanding 2 machine gun sections, Basilone became a one-man army when the Japanese concentrated their attack on his position. With his gun crews dead or wounded, he moved back and forth between the nests, repairing jammed weapons in the pitch black and manning the guns himself. At one point, he held off an entire Japanese platoon with nothing but his pistol and a machete. When ammunition ran critically low, he fought his way through enemy-infested lines to bring back more belts. His relentless fire created a wall of lead that the Japanese simply could not breach, piling bodies so high in front of his position that they had to be knocked down to clear the field of fire. By dawn on October 25th, the first wave of the Sendai Division had been broken. The jungle floor was a carpet of corpses, but Maruyama was not done. Believing that one more push would crack the American line, He reorganized his shattered regiments for a second assault the following night. The Japanese officers, refusing to accept defeat, readied their men for a final sacrifice. Inside the American perimeter, the defenders used the daylight to redistribute ammunition and deepen their fighting holes, knowing that the enemy would return. The air was thick with the stench of death, a grim reminder of the price of the previous night's victory. The second night of the battle, October 25th to 26th, was a repetition of the slaughter, but with even more tragic futility for the Japanese. Maruyama threw his reserves, the 16th and 29th regiments, against the same fortified positions. The Americans, now reinforced and fully alerted, unleashed a devastating barrage of 105 mm artillery and 37 mm canister shot. The Japanese attacks were disjointed, lacking the coordination needed to break through. Officers led charge after charge into the teeth of the American guns, decimating the leadership of the division. The spirit of the Yamato was shattered by the industrial efficiency of American firepower. As the sun rose on October 26th, the grand offensive had effectively ended. The scene in front of Pullers and the 164th's lines was gruesome beyond description. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the clearing and the surrounding jungle. The Sendai Division, one of the finest units in the Imperial Army, had ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. General Maruyama, weeping with shame, ordered the survivors to retreat back down the Maruyama Road. They left behind their dead, their wounded, and their honor, beginning a trek back to the coast that would claim thousands more lives through starvation and disease. The battle for Henderson Field was the decisive turning point of the land campaign. The Japanese had thrown their best punch, a massive coordinated corps-level offensive, and it had been blocked. The Americans had proved that they could not only hold the airfield, but could destroy the best troops the Empire could send against them. The victory was a validation of the one-team concept, proving that Marine and Army units could fight side by side effectively. For the Japanese, the realization began to sink in that Guadalcanal might be a lost cause. They had expended their strength in the jungle, and now, with their army broken and starving, the initiative passed irrevocably to the Americans. The destruction of the Sendai Division was not merely a result of infantry tenacity. It was a triumph of industrial slaughter orchestrated by the 11th Marine Artillery Regiment. As the Japanese waves crashed against the perimeter wire on those fateful October nights, the American artillerymen were working in a rhythmic trance, stripping off their shirts in the heat, feeding 105 mm shells into the breeches of their howitzers as fast as they could pull the lanyards. The coordination was devastatingly precise. Forward observers, huddled in the mud with the infantry, called down boxing barrages that walled off the Japanese attackers on three sides, channeling them into pre-registered kill zones. For the Japanese soldier running through the dark, the air itself seemed to turn into shrapnel. There was no place to hide. The jungle canopy detonated the shells before they hit the ground, showering the earth with jagged steel rain that shredded trees and men with equal indifference. The defining sound of this slaughter was the sharp crack thump of the 37 mm anti-tank guns firing canister shot. These weapons, originally designed to pierce armor, had been repurposed as giant shotguns to stop massed infantry. Each round unleashed hundreds of steel balls that spread out in a lethal cone, tearing through the dense formations of the Sendai charge. Japanese soldiers, screaming and sprinting with bayonets fixed, would suddenly dissolve into mist and red ruin. The power of these weapons was so great that they physically pushed the attacking waves backward. It was not a battle of maneuver. It was a mechanical erasure of human life. The American gunners fired until their barrels warped and the paint blistered off the steel, creating a literal wall of fire that no amount of spiritual courage could breach. Inside the Japanese lines, the command structure was disintegrating under the weight of this bombardment. General Nasu, commanding the infantry group, was fatally wounded by artillery fire as he tried to rally his men. Colonel Furumiya, leading the 29th Regiment, managed to penetrate the American lines with a handful of men, only to find himself trapped in a pocket of crossfire. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, he knelt amidst the cacophony of exploding shells and tore the regimental colors, the sacred flag presented by the emperor, into strips, burning them to prevent the disgrace of capture. He then committed suicide, his body joining the mounting pile of the empire's best and brightest. The leadership of the division was being decapitated shell by shell. The fanaticism of the Sendai division, however, turned a defeat into a massacre. Despite the impassable wall of fire, the Japanese officers refused to call off the attacks. They continued to blow their whistles and wave their swords, ordering fresh companies to charge over the bodies of the previous wave. This refusal to adapt to the reality of American firepower created a gruesome logistical problem for the defenders. The piles of Japanese dead grew so high that they physically blocked the fields of fire for the machine guns. American Marines had to risk their lives to crawl out during lulls in the fighting to drag the corpses away, just so they could have a clear line of sight to kill the next wave. By the morning of October 27th, the firing finally ceased, leaving behind a silence that was even more disturbing than the noise. The rising sun revealed a landscape that looked less like a battlefield and more like an abattoir. The clearing in front of the American lines was carpeted with thousands of bodies, twisted together in the mud. The sheer density of the dead was shocking even to the veterans of World War I who were present. It was visible proof that the age of the samurai charge was over. Flesh and bone, no matter how disciplined, could not survive against massed automatic weapons and artillery. The Sendai division had not just been defeated. It had been spent like currency in a failed gamble. The psychological impact on the survivors was absolute. The Japanese soldiers who had managed to crawl back into the jungle were shell-shocked and broken. They had been told that the Americans were weak, that they would flee at the sight of cold steel. Instead, they had faced a disciplined enemy who possessed an inexhaustible supply of ammunition. The mystique of their own invincibility was buried in the mud alongside their comrades. Many of the survivors had discarded their rifles and helmets in their panic to escape the artillery, reducing them from an elite fighting force to a ragged mob of refugees. General Maruyama, staring at the remnants of his once proud division, was forced to make the agonizing decision to retreat. But the return journey promised to be even more deadly than the advance. The Maruyama Road had turned into a swamp. There was no food left. The soldiers had eaten their last rations of rice days ago. There were no medical supplies for the thousands of wounded who were groaning in the makeshift aid stations. Maruyama ordered a retreat, but he knew that for the severely wounded, this order was a death sentence. Many of the injured were given hand grenades and left behind to guard the rear, a euphemism for committing suicide to avoid slowing down the column. As the retreat began, the Americans did not immediately pursue, largely because they were still processing the magnitude of the slaughter they had just inflicted. They brought in bulldozers to dig mass graves, pushing the tangled mounds of Japanese bodies into the earth in a grim attempt to sanitize the battlefield before the tropical heat caused disease to spread. The sight of the bulldozers was the final indignity for the watching Japanese stragglers. Their sacrifice was being treated as a sanitation problem. The Sendai name, once feared throughout China and Java, was now synonymous with feudal death. The failure of the Sendai offensive marked the end of Japan's ability to launch major offensive operations on Guadalcanal. They had thrown their heaviest hammer, and it had shattered against the anvil of the marine defense. The 2nd Division had suffered over 50% casualties, with some regiments being nearly wiped out. The loss of experienced officers and NCOs was catastrophic and irreplaceable. From this point on, the Japanese army would no longer be the hunter. They were the prey. The survivors limped back into the deep jungle, leaving the sound of the American guns behind them, but walking into a new and slower form of hell. They were entering a phase of the campaign where the enemy was no longer the U.S. Marines, but starvation, malaria, and fungal rot. The swift death of the artillery barrage was replaced by the slow, agonizing death of the starvation island. The wall of fire had done its job. Now, the jungle would finish what the artillery had started. The retreat of the broken Sendai Division back toward the western coast was not a military maneuver. It was a slow-motion tragedy. The Maruyama Road, which had been cut with such hopeful determination just weeks earlier, was now a trail of the dying. The jungle, indifferent to human suffering, turned the return journey into a torture chamber. Heavy rains transformed the track into a river of thigh-deep mud that sucked the boots off men's feet. Soldiers who had charged into machine gun fire without flinching now collapsed from the simple exertion of lifting their legs. There were no stretchers and no bearers left. The wounded were forced to crawl or rely on the shoulders of comrades who were themselves teetering on the brink of collapse. The route was marked not by signposts, but by the bodies of those who simply sat down to rest and never stood up again. As the column disintegrated, the reality of their logistical failure set in with terrifying clarity. During the advance, in a gamble for speed, the troops had been ordered to carry only enough rice for the attack, expecting to feast on captured American supplies. Now, with the attack failed and the American warehouses out of reach, there was nothing. The daily ration was reduced to a handful of moldy rice, then a spoonful, and finally nothing at all. Men began to forage with the desperation of animals. They ate fern roots that knotted their stomachs with cramps. They hunted lizards and insects. In their delirium, some chewed on their leather belts or the straps of their equipment, desperate for anything to dull the gnawing pain of an empty stomach. But hunger was only one head of the Hydra devouring the 17th Army. The other was disease. The mosquito-infested swamps of Guadalcanal were a breeding ground for virulent strains of malaria and dengue fever. Without quinine or medical supplies, the fever swept through the ranks like a wildfire. Men burned with temperatures of 105 degrees, shivering uncontrollably in the tropical heat, their brains boiling in their skulls. Dysentery followed, a humiliating and lethal affliction that drained the body of fluids and dignity. The trail was lined with men lying in their own filth, too weak to brush away the flies that clustered on their open sores. The jungle floor became a graveyard of the living, where the only sound was the raspy breathing of thousands of dying men. The Japanese name for Guadalcanal changed during these weeks. It was no longer the island of death or a strategic objective. The soldiers began to call it Gado, Starvation Island. A grim grimace of dark humor circulated among the troops, a life expectancy table that became a common mantra. He who can stand can live for 30 days. He who can sit can live for 20 days. He who must urinate lying down will live for 3 days. This was not an exaggeration, but a clinical observation of their own atrophy. The once proud warriors of the Imperial Army were reduced to skeletal figures, their uniforms hanging off their frames like rags on scarecrows, their eyes sunken into hollow sockets, staring blankly at a future that held only death. When the ragged survivors finally stumbled out of the jungle and reached the coast at Cape Esperance, they found no salvation. The headquarters of the 17th Army was in a state of paralysis. Supplies from Rabaul had effectively ceased. The American air superiority, now absolute during the day, meant that slow transport ships could not get through. The Tokyo Express destroyers continued to run, but they could only carry a fraction of the necessary food, and often, the floating drums they dropped offshore were swept away by the tide or sunk by American PT boats before they could be retrieved. The soldiers on the beach watched with hollow eyes as their dinner floated out to sea, leaving them to starve within sight of the ocean. The breakdown of a logistical chain led to a collapse of social order within the units. While discipline held in some quarters, in others, the primal instinct for survival took over. Theft became rampant. Soldiers hoarded tiny caches of rice, guarding them with grenades. Officers who were supposed to eat last sometimes ate while their men starved, leading to a simmering resentment that eroded the traditional bond of loyalty. The forest around the encampments was stripped bare of all vegetation. Palm trees were felled just to eat the heart of the palm. The army was literally eating the island, consuming the landscape in a futile attempt to stay alive. For the Americans, the Japanese condition remained partially hidden, but the evidence was becoming undeniable. Marine patrols venturing into the jungle began to encounter less resistance and more tragedy. They found Japanese soldiers wandering in a daze, using their rifles as crutches, too weak to lift the weapon to fire. They found bivouacs filled with unburied dead, the air thick with a sickly sweet smell of rotting flesh and sickness that became the olfactory signature of the Japanese lines. The Americans, well-fed and constantly resupplied, looked at these walking skeletons with a mixture of revulsion and pity. The enemy was no longer a terrifying Superman. He was a biological wreck. Despite this, the Japanese High Command refused to evacuate. In Tokyo, the generals could not conceive of the depth of the disaster. They continued to issue orders for future offensives, moving pins on a map that represented units that no longer existed. They demanded that the troops hold their positions, urging them to fight with spiritual strength to overcome the lack of food. This disconnection between the fantasy of the headquarters and the reality of Gado was the ultimate betrayal of the common soldier. They were being asked to hold a line with nothing but their bodies, which were failing them by the hour. By late November, the 17th Army was no longer a combat-effective force. It was a massive humanitarian crisis wearing a uniform. The strongest men were barely capable of pulling a trigger, let alone launching a bayonet charge. The jungle had done what the American Marines could not do alone. It had hollowed out the enemy army from the inside. The malaria parasites and the empty rice bowls had killed more men than the artillery at the Tenaru or the machine guns at Bloody Ridge. As December approached, the heavens opened up, and the monsoon rains began in earnest, turning the entire western end of the island into a gray, sodden purgatory. The Japanese soldiers, huddled under rotting canvas or broad leaves, waited for an end to their suffering. They wrote final letters to their families on the backs of maps or diaries, apologizing for dying without achieving victory. Guadalcanal had become a tomb, and the 17th Army was slowly, quietly being buried alive by the island itself. The fighting was not over, but the myth of the Japanese offensive power had been starved into submission. As the physical condition of the Japanese army deteriorated into a nightmare of starvation and disease, a profound psychological shift began to take root in the minds of the survivors. For years, the indoctrination had been absolute. Americans were individualistic weaklings, corrupted by jazz and capitalism, who would crumble before the spiritual purity of the samurai. But on Guadalcanal, this caricature was violently dismantled. The Japanese soldier, shivering in his waterlogged foxhole, watched the decadent enemy endure the same mosquitoes, the same heat, and the same terrifying nights, yet refused to break. The realization was slow but crushing. The Americans were not cowards. They were a different kind of warrior, one who fought with a cold, professional efficiency that was just as lethal, if not more so, than the bonsai spirit. The disdain for American materialism turned into a fearful envy. In the early days, Japanese officers had mocked the American reliance on supply lines, viewing it as a crutch. Now, staring across the lines from their starving encampments, they saw that crutch as a weapon of terrifying power. They watched with hollow eyes as American planes dropped parachutes of food and ammunition daily, while they scrounged for roots. They saw the Marines on the beach unloading crates of Spam, chocolate, and cigarettes, while the Imperial Army dissolved from malnutrition. The Japanese soldier began to realize that the industrial might of the United States was not a sign of weakness, but a relentless force of nature that cared for its men so they could continue to kill efficiently. The softness of the American lifestyle was actually the foundation of their endurance. The combat performance of the U.S. Marines also forced a grudging revision of the Japanese military code. The Japanese had expected the Americans to surrender when cornered, but at the Tenaru and the Matanakaw, they had seen Marines fight to the death with knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. The corrupt businessman narrative could not explain the savagery of the Marine counterattacks. Diaries recovered from dead Japanese officers during this period revealed a change in tone from arrogance to bewildered respect. One entry noted, "The Americans are not the soldiers we were told of. They fight with the ferocity of demons and the discipline of machines. They do not run." The enemy had morphed from a cartoon into a monster. Furthermore, The Japanese were stunned by the American ability to adapt. When the campaign began, the Marines were green, making noise in the jungle and triggering ambushes. But the Americans were quick studies. Within months, the amateurs had become jungle experts, learning to move silently, use the terrain, and set their own deadly traps. The Japanese advantage in night fighting, their prized specialty, began to erode as the Americans developed better listening posts and utilized technology like early radar and coordinated artillery flares. The Japanese realized they were not fighting a static enemy, but a dynamic learning organization that improved with every skirmish. The sheer volume of American firepower also sparked a reassessment of what bravery meant. The Japanese concept of bravery was linked to exposure, charging into fire, dying gloriously. The American concept was about fire superiority, using machines to kill the enemy before he could get close. Initially viewed as cowardly, the Japanese survivors began to see the terrifying logic in it. Why charge a machine gun when you can bury it with artillery? The Japanese soldier, holding his single-shot bolt-action Arisaka, felt a deep sense of technological inferiority against the semi-automatic M1 Garand and the endless belts of the Browning machine guns. They realized they were bringing a sword to a gunfight against a foe who had an infinite supply of bullets. This shift in perception reached the highest levels of the Imperial Navy as well. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, the brilliant commander of the Tokyo Express, was among the first to recognize the tenacity of the American sailor. After the brutal night battles of Cape Esperance and the messy brawls in Iron Bottom Sound, Tanaka acknowledged that the U.S. Navy was not the timid force they had faced in exercises. They were aggressive, willing to take massive casualties to hold the blockade. Tanaka's reports to Tokyo began to contain veiled warnings that the sleeping giant was fully awake and that the quality of the American fighting man had been grossly underestimated by the general staff. The most demoralizing sight for the Japanese, however, was the airfield itself. Henderson Field became a symbol of the American Hydra. No matter how many times the battleships Congo and Haruna shelled it, or how many bombers pounded it from Rabaul, the Americans simply fixed it. The Japanese watched in awe as the Seabees construction battalions emerged from their bunkers the moment the shelling stopped. With bulldozers and steel Marston matting, they filled the craters and paved the runway in hours, not weeks. To a Japanese army that relied on manual labor and pickaxes, this mechanized construction capability was disheartening. It sent a clear message: you cannot destroy us fast enough. By December, the racial superiority that had fueled the Japanese war effort was replaced by a complex inferiority complex. The propaganda broadcasts from Tokyo, claiming great victories and American cowardice, sounded like cruel jokes to the men rotting on the island. The average soldier stopped believing in the infallibility of the emperor's generals. They began to see themselves not as the protagonists of a divine war, but as victims of their own leadership's arrogance. The American coward was a lie that had led them into a trap from which there was no escape. Even the arrival of fresh American Army units, specifically the 164th Infantry and later the 25th Infantry Division, reinforced this new respect. The Japanese had hoped that the citizen soldiers of the U.S. Army would be softer than the Marines. Instead, they found that the Army troops, armed with the same overwhelming firepower and backed by the same logistics, were just as deadly. The depth of the American bench was terrifying. As the Japanese withered away, the Americans just kept bringing in more men, fresh and healthy, rotating out their exhausted units. The Japanese realized they were fighting a nation that could replace entire divisions like spare parts. Ultimately, this shift in perception changed the way the Japanese fought the remainder of the campaign. The reckless banzai charges ceased, replaced by a grim determination to sell their lives as dearly as possible from fortified caves and bunkers. They no longer sought to break the American spirit, for they knew it was unbreakable. Instead, they sought only to bleed the giant, to inflict so much pain that perhaps the Americans would tire of the slaughter. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of the underdog. The Japanese soldier now knew exactly who he was fighting, a rich, relentless, and technologically superior enemy who was slowly, methodically, closing the coffin lid on the empire's ambitions. By December 1942, the complexion of the war on Guadalcanal had changed fundamentally. The battered 1st Marine Division, having carried the torch for 4 devastating months, was finally withdrawn, replaced by the fresh soldiers of the U.S. Army's 14th Corps under Major General Alexander Patch. The strategic objective shifted from desperate defense to aggressive eradication. It was no longer enough to simply hold the perimeter around Henderson Field. The Americans now had the manpower and the logistics to push west and drive the Japanese into the sea. However, the Japanese 17th Army, though starving and disease-ridden, had not simply melted away. Under the command of the stubborn Colonel Ikenosuke Oka, they had utilized the lull in fighting to transform the high ground overlooking the Matanikaw River into a series of impregnable fortresses, intending to bleed the American advance for every yard of jungle. The primary obstacle blocking the American advance was a chaotic mass of ridges and ravines dominated by Mount Austin. From the air, the topographic features bore a strange resemblance to animals, earning them nicknames that would become synonymous with misery: the galloping horse and the sea horse. Between these ridges lay a defensive pocket known as the Gifu, named after the Japanese prefecture from which many of the defenders hailed. The Gifu was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Hidden beneath the canopy of giant mahogany trees, the Japanese had constructed a horseshoe-shaped network of over 40 mutually supporting bunkers. Built with logs and earth, camouflaged by ferns, and immune to light mortar fire, these positions allowed the Japanese to pin down entire battalions without ever revealing their location. The task of cracking this nut fell to the 25th Infantry Division, nicknamed Tropic Lightning. These soldiers were fresh, healthy, and well-equipped, a stark contrast to the skeletons they were fighting. However, upon entering the jungle in early January 1943, they quickly learned that technology had its limits in the rainforest. As the 35th Infantry Regiment moved against the Gifu's strongpoint, they walked into a buzzsaw. Japanese machine guns, sighted down narrow fire lanes cut through the undergrowth, tore through the lead platoons. The Americans would dive for cover, only to find that the fire was coming from invisible spider holes on their flanks. It was a terrifying game of blind man's bluff, where the penalty for movement was death. Simultaneously, the 27th Infantry Regiment launched its assault on the Galloping Horse Ridge. The terrain here was a torture test of verticality. The ridge rose sharply out of the jungle, covered in slippery grass and exposed to the baking tropical sun. The Japanese were dug in along the spine of the horse, raining grenades down on the Americans struggling up the slopes. The heat was as deadly as the enemy. Men collapsed from heat stroke, vomiting and convulsing as they tried to haul heavy ammunition crates up grades that required hands and knees to climb. Water became the most precious commodity on the battlefield, with water trains of soldiers passing 5-gallon jerry cans up the line under fire, only for the supply to evaporate in the parched throats of the riflemen within minutes. The stalemate on the Galloping Horse was finally broken by individual acts of frantic heroism. In a defining moment of the campaign, Captain Charles Davis saw his company pinned down by Japanese machine guns located in the neck of the horse. Realizing that the attack was stalling, Davis crawled forward through the tall grass, ignoring the bullets whipping past him. When he was within range, he stood up a silhouette against the sky and hurled grenades into the Japanese nest. His men, galvanized by the sight of their commander's reckless courage, rose from the grass and charged. The ridge was taken in a flurry of violence, clearing the western flank of the Gifu and isolating the main Japanese stronghold. However, the Gifu pocket itself remained a stubborn knot that refused to untie. For weeks, the 25th Division hammered it with artillery, but the thick jungle canopy detonated the shells in the treetops, raining shrapnel harmlessly over the covered bunkers. The stalemate became a source of immense frustration for General Patch. He authorized the use of loudspeakers to broadcast surrender appeals to the trapped Japanese. The response was a defiant silence, followed by a renewed burst of machine gun fire. The defenders of the Gifu, commanded by Major Inagaki, were living in squalor, surrounded by the rotting corpses of their comrades and starving to death. Yet they had sworn a blood oath to hold the position until the last man. To break the deadlock, the Americans had to improvise. They managed to bulldoze a rough trail up the backside of the ridge, a feat of engineering that allowed a single tank to be winched up the muddy slope. The arrival of the light tank changed the physics of the battle. It rumbled into the Gifu clearing, blasting the log bunkers at point-blank range with canister shot. Infantrymen followed close behind, using flamethrowers and satchel charges to incinerate the spider holes. It was a gruesome, slow-motion process of extermination. The final grind was not a battle of maneuver, but a systematic unearthing of a dug-in enemy, similar to digging out a colony of termites. Inside the Gifu, the end was apocalyptic. Major Inagaki, realizing the perimeter was collapsing, ordered a final, desperate charge. It was not a grand bonsai attack, but the lurching advance of dying men. On the night of January 22nd, nearly 100 Japanese soldiers, emaciated and ragged, hurled themselves at the American lines. They were cut down by the disciplined fire of the 35th Infantry. When the sun rose, the Gifu was silent. The Americans walked through the shattered remains of the strongpoint, finding bodies that were little more than skin and bones. The pocket that had held up an entire division for weeks had been reduced to a graveyard. With the Gifu and the galloping horse secured, the hard crust of the Japanese defense was finally broken. The view from the top of Mount Austin offered the Americans a commanding vista of the western coast. They could see the sparkle of the sea at Cape Esperance, the ultimate objective. For the first time in 6 months, the Americans looked down on their enemy. The capture of the high ground meant that Japanese artillery could no longer shell Henderson Field. The airbase was safe, finally and truly safe, allowing the planes to focus entirely on hunting the retreating columns. The fall of the ridges marked the end of organized, static resistance on Guadalcanal. The Japanese 17th Army ceased to be a blockade and became a fugitive force. The fighting transformed into a pursuit, a rabbit hunt, as the soldiers called it, chasing the remnants of the enemy toward the evacuation points. The grind of January had been the most physically demanding phase of the campaign for the U.S. Army, but it had achieved what the initial landings could not. It broke the back of the Japanese defenses and turned the page toward the final chapter of the island's bloody history. In the austere conference rooms of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, a heavy silence hung over the maps of the South Pacific. The Emperor himself had asked a simple, cutting question. Why does it take so long to capture one island? The answer, which the generals could no longer obscure, was that Guadalcanal was lost. To continue pouring men into the bottomless pit of the Solomons would risk the destruction of the entire army. In a rare display of pragmatic realism, the High Command authorized Operation Coup, a plan not for victory, but for salvation. The objective was to evacuate the starving remnants of the 17th Army. However, this operation required a deception of monumental proportions. If the Americans realized the Japanese were retreating, their aircraft and PT boats would massacre the defenseless transport fleets. To save their men, the Japanese had to convince the world they were preparing for one final massive offensive. The deception campaign began in late January 1943 with a flurry of aggressive activity that completely bewildered American intelligence. The Japanese Air Force at Rabaul launched a sudden surge of air superiority sweeps, engaging the Cactus Air Force with a renewed ferocity that suggested they were clearing the skies for a landing. Simultaneously, Japanese naval movements intensified, with submarines and destroyers gathering in the northern Solomons. To the Americans, who were still traumatized by the memories of the Sendai offensive, every sign pointed to another major assault. Admiral Halsey and General Patch, fearing a fresh invasion, ordered their ground forces to advance with extreme caution, slowing the pursuit of the retreating enemy to a crawl. The ruse was working perfectly. The Americans were bracing for a punch that would never come. On the ground, the retreat toward Cape Esperance was a grim procession of the living dead. The order to withdraw was whispered down the line, sparking a mixture of relief and shame among the soldiers who had sworn to die for the Emperor. The route to the evacuation point was a narrow, muddy trail along the jagged coastline. For the thousands of men too weak to walk, there was no salvation. The medical officers were faced with the agonizing duty of handing out hand grenades and potassium cyanide vials to the immobile wounded, leaving them behind to die by their own hand rather than slow down the column. The trail was marked by the sounds of these solitary explosions, a lonely fanfare for the abandoned. To protect the retreating main body, a fresh unit, the Yano Battalion, was landed at the rear of the withdrawal. These men were fresh, well-fed, and heavily armed, and their mission was suicidal. They were to act as a human shield, holding off the American advance just long enough for the boats to arrive. They dug into the ridges overlooking the pursuit corridors and fought with a ferocious intensity that further convinced the Americans that the Japanese were digging in for a long siege. This stubborn rear-guard action bought precious hours, allowing the skeletal survivors of the Sendai and 2nd Divisions to limp toward the dark beaches of the western tip. The first evacuation run took place on the night of February 1st. A squadron of 20 destroyers, led by the brilliant Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto, raced down the slot. As they approached Cape Esperance, they did not slow down to unload troops. They stopped to pick them up. The discipline on the beach was absolute. There was no panic, no mob scene. The soldiers, ragged and reeking of dysentery, waded silently into the surf to climb the rope nets designated for supplies. In a matter of hours, nearly 5,000 men were plucked from the darkness and packed onto the destroyers. By the time American PT boats realized the ships were there, the Tokyo Express had already turned around and vanished into the mist, leaving only the wake of their propellers. The Americans were baffled. They reported engaging the destroyers, but they couldn't understand why the Japanese ships were fleeing without offloading barges. Intelligence analysts debated furiously. Had the Japanese landed fresh troops? Had they resupplied the garrison? The possibility of a mass evacuation was dismissed as un-Japanese, a violation of the Bushido Code. This cultural blind spot kept the American forces tentative. They continued to shell the empty jungle and probe cautiously against the Yano Battalion, unaware that the bulk of the enemy army was slipping through their fingers like water. On the night of February 4th, the destroyers returned. This time, American aircraft managed to attack the flotilla, damaging the destroyer Mikes, but the operation continued with mechanical efficiency. Another 4,000 men were lifted from the beach. Among them were the highest-ranking officers, including General Hyakutake, who had to be practically carried aboard, weeping at the disgrace of leaving the battlefield. The destroyers were so crowded that men stood shoulder to shoulder on the decks, shielding the sick from the spray of the ocean. As the coastline of Guadalcanal faded into the darkness, many soldiers refused to look back at the island that had consumed their youth and their strength. By February 7th, the final stage of Operation Ko was underway. The Yano Battalion, having successfully held the Americans at bay, abandoned their foxholes and sprinted for the beach. The last run was tense. The moon was rising, and the window of darkness was closing. The boat crews moved with frantic speed, rowing the last stragglers out to the waiting warships. Admiral Hashimoto waited until the very last moment, scanning the beach with binoculars to ensure no serviceable men were left behind. As a final destroyer weighed anchor, the silence of the grave descended on Cape Esperance. The Japanese were gone. The next morning, February 8th, the U.S. Army forces finally launched their major attack to crush the Japanese pocket at Cape Esperance. Artillery barges pounded the coastline, and infantry units swept forward with bayonets fixed, expecting a bloody fight to the finish. Instead, they found nothing. The beaches were empty. There were no enemy soldiers, only abandoned equipment, piles of rusted rifles, broken radios, and torn uniforms flapping in the breeze. The jungle, which had been a terrifying combat zone for 6 months, was suddenly just trees and vines again. The enemy had vanished into thin air. The realization of what had happened was a shock to the American command. General Patch walked the deserted beaches, looking at the detritus of a vanished army. Operation Ko had been a tactical masterpiece, The Japanese had successfully evacuated over 10,000 men from right under the guns of a superior force. It was a humiliating intelligence failure for the U.S., but as the soldiers looked out over the empty ocean, the feeling was not one of anger, but of immense, overwhelming relief. The evacuation meant the campaign was over. There would be no more banzai charges, no more sleepless nights. They had not captured the Japanese army, but they had captured Guadalcanal. The long nightmare was finally over. On February 9, 1943, Major General Alexander Patch sent a radio message to Admiral Halsey that was as brief as it was historic. Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal. With those words, the 6-month struggle for a remote, pestilent island in the South Pacific officially came to an end. The silence that descended on Guadalcanal was disorienting for the survivors. For half a year, the air had been filled with the drone of aircraft, the thump of artillery, and the crack of rifles. Now, the only sounds were the breaking surf and the squawking of tropical birds. The Americans stood on the beaches, dirty, bearded, and exhausted, realizing that they had done what the world thought was impossible. They had stopped the Japanese juggernaut dead in its tracks. The psychological fog of war lifted to reveal a clear, undeniable victory. But it was a victory purchased at a staggering price. The butcher's bill for the campaign was horrifying. The island had become a graveyard for the Japanese 17th Army. Of the roughly 36,000 Japanese troops committed to the island, over 31,000 were lost. They had died not just from American bullets, but from the jungle itself. Malaria, starvation, and dysentery had claimed nearly as many lives as combat. The Americans had suffered too, with over 7,000 killed on land and at sea, and thousands more incapacitated by disease. The waters of Iron Bottom Sound contained more tonnage of sunken warships than any other place on Earth, a rusting underwater monument to the ferocity of the naval clashes. The physical cost proved that the war in the Pacific would be a brutal war of attrition, a meat grinder that would consume men and machines at a rate never before seen in history. Strategically, Guadalcanal was the hinge upon which the entire Pacific War turned. Before August 1942, the Japanese Empire had been expanding outward like a supernova, seizing territory at will. After February 1943, that expansion contracted forever. The campaign destroyed the myth of the defensive perimeter. Japan had planned to force the U.S. to bleed itself dry against a ring of fortified islands. But Guadalcanal proved that the Americans could pierce that ring and hold onto the territory they took. The initiative had passed irrevocably to the Allies. From this point forward, Tokyo would be reacting to Washington's moves, forced onto a defensive footing from which they would never recover. The Operation FS plan to cut off Australia was dead. The supply lines to the chaotic southern continent were now secure. The most profound legacy, however, was psychological. The campaign shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. For decades, and especially after the fall of Singapore and the Philippines, the Japanese soldier was viewed as a superman, a warrior of the bush who could move invisibly and fight with a spirit that Westerners could not match. Guadalcanal exposed the flaw in this mythology. Spirit cannot stop shrapnel. The battles of the Tenaru and Bloody Ridge proved that the Japanese army was tactically rigid and prone to suicidal errors when their plans failed. The Americans learned that the Japanese were dangerous and fanatical. Yes, but they were also mortal. They could be outmaneuvered, outgunned, and ultimately beaten. The fear of the unknown that had paralyzed the Allies in early 1942 was replaced by a grim, workmanlike confidence. Furthermore, the campaign bled the Japanese military of its most precious resource, its veterans. The meat grinder of the Solomons consumed the elite cadre of the Imperial Navy's aviators. The aces who had attacked Pearl Harbor were shot down over Henderson Field, replaced by green pilots who were no match for the improving American flyers. On the ground, the Sendai Division and the Ichiki Detachment, the pride of the Imperial Army, had been wiped out. These were men with years of combat experience in China. They were the backbone of the army, and they were irreplaceable. Japan began the war with a first-rate military, But Guadalcanal began the process of eroding it into a third-rate force, manned by conscripts who lacked the skill of their predecessors. Conversely, Guadalcanal was the schoolhouse where the American military learned how to fight. The U.S. Marines and Army units that landed in August were amateurs, struggling with logistics and unaccustomed to the jungle. By February, they were hardened professionals. They had developed the tactics that would carry them to Tokyo. The integration of air, land, and sea power, the use of massive artillery support to clear bunkers, and the logistical mastery required to support a division thousands of miles from home. The coordination between the Navy and the ground forces, which had been disastrous at Savo Island, was refined into a lethal partnership. The mistakes made on Guadalcanal were paid for in blood, but the lessons learned saved countless lives in the invasions to come. The campaign also highlighted the decisive role of logistics and industrial capacity. The Japanese defeat was ultimately a failure of supply. They could not feed their troops or fuel their planes, while the Americans, despite the shoestring start, eventually turned the island into a massive supply dump. The Tokyo Express was a desperate improvisation that failed, while the American Merchant Marine built a bridge of ships across the Pacific. It became clear that Japan's economy could not sustain a long war against the industrial might of the United States. Guadalcanal demonstrated that modern war was not just about samurai spirit. It was about the ability to deliver tons of rice, quinine, and aviation fuel to the front lines every single day. With the island secured, the Allies now had a strategic springboard. Henderson Field, once a muddy strip of coral, was transformed into a major bomber base. From here, American planes could reach Rabaul, the great Japanese fortress to the north. The roadmap to victory was now clear. Move up the Solomon Chain island by island, isolating Japanese garrisons and using air power to strangle their supply lines. The island-hopping strategy was born in the mud of Guadalcanal. The conquest of the island was the first step on a long road that would lead through Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But it was the most important step because it proved the journey was possible. For the men who fought there, the canal became a badge of honor and a haunting memory. They had endured a living hell that few back home could understand. They had lived like animals, rotting in the rain, surrounded by death, yet they had prevailed. The animosity forged here would define the savagery of the Pacific War. There was no chivalry in the Solomons, only a kill-or-be-killed hatred that would persist until the final surrender. The Marines and soldiers who survived carried a swagger that came from knowing they had faced the worst the enemy had to offer and had emerged victorious. As the sun set over the Pacific on that final day of the campaign, the Japanese Empire was already beginning to unravel. The soldiers who had been told that Americans were cowards had died, discovering the opposite. The sleeping giant was fully awake, armed and angry. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, filled with more horrors and more islands, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The tide of the war had not just turned. It had crashed against the shores of Guadalcanal and washed away the foundations of the Japanese Empire. The rising sun had reached its zenith, and now, inevitably, the long, dark sunset had begun.